Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. What happened to me in the woods of Pacific County back in 1979 still gives me the creeps when I think about it. I'm not one for making up stories or seeing things that aren't there. I've been hunting these woods my whole life, and I know the difference between animals and whatever this was. It was late October 1979. Might have been early November. The days kind of blur together after all these years. I had taken a few days off work at the mill to go deer hunting. The season had been pretty disappointing so far. I'd seen tracks but no deer. That morning was cold as hell, frost on everything, and a fog that hung low in the trees, making visibility poor. I'd been out since before dawn, moving quietly through my usual spots. By about noon, my fingers were numb, and my stomach was growling something fierce. I decided to head back to my truck for lunch. I was parked in this good-sized clearing, probably around 25-30 acres of open space, surrounded by dense firs and underbrush. It was one of my favorite spots because you could see across the whole area, and deer sometimes wandered out to graze. I climbed into my pickup, a beat-up '73 Ford that had seen better days but never failed me in those mountains. I had packed a couple sandwiches my wife made the night before, ham and cheese with that spicy mustard I love. I cracked open a thermos of coffee, unwrapped the wax paper from my first sandwich, and started eating while looking out at the clearing. That's when the feeling hit me. You know that sensation when you know someone's watching you. The little hairs on your neck stand up, and something primitive in your brain screams that you're being observed. That's exactly what happened. I froze mid-bite and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The clearing was dead silent, which, if you've spent time in the woods, is actually strange. Usually there's birds, small animals rustling around. But there was just nothing. The silence was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept eating, but slower now, keeping my eyes on the edge of the clearing. About halfway through my second sandwich, I caught movement in the bushes directly across from where I'd parked. Just a slight shifting of branches, nothing dramatic, but definitely not caused by wind since it was a still day. My first thought was moose. We get them occasionally in that area, and they can be dangerous if startled. So I put my half-eaten sandwich down on the rim of the pickup box, you know, that flat part at the top of the truck bed, and grabbed my rifle from the rack behind my seat. I wasn't planning to shoot anything, just wanted protection if it turned out to be a predator. I decided to circle around and see what was moving in those bushes. Looking back, it was probably pretty stupid to leave my truck, but at the time I was curious and figured it was just some animal I could maybe get a shot at if it was deer. I left the truck and moved along the edge of the clearing, keeping low and trying to be quiet. The ground was damp from the morning fog, which helped muffle my footsteps. It took me a good 15 minutes to work my way around to the spot where I'd seen the movement. But when I got there, I found nothing. No moose, no deer, not even tracks that I could see. I spent about 25 minutes searching the area, pushing deeper into the woods, looking for signs of whatever had been there. The brush was thick, and visibility was poor once you got away from the clearing. I remember feeling increasingly uneasy, like I was being led away on purpose. After searching fruitlessly for almost an hour, I decided to head back to my truck. I was hungry, cold, and starting to feel that familiar dread that comes when you realize you might be lost. The forest had a strange quality that day. The fog made familiar landmarks look alien, and I had gone farther into the woods than I intended. When I finally made it back to the clearing, I immediately noticed something was wrong with my truck. Even from a distance, I could tell something was different. As I got closer, I realized what it was. My sandwich was gone. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe a bird took it or it fell off. But here's the weird part. Where my sandwich had been sitting on the rim of the truck bed was a massive fir cone. And when I say massive, I mean this thing was huge, like the size of a small pineapple. It was placed exactly where my sandwich had been, positioned deliberately and carefully. I stood there staring at this cone, trying to process what I was seeing. The sandwich wrapper was gone too. Not on the ground, not inside the truck bed, just completely gone. My heart started pounding as I slowly turned to scan the clearing again. Something had approached my truck while I was gone, taken my food, and left this payment, gift, warning. I don't know what to call it. I climbed into my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I kept looking at that damn pine cone, trying to make sense of it. It was positioned so deliberately that it couldn't have been coincidence or animal behavior. Not any animal I knew, anyway. As I started the engine, I glanced in my rearview mirror and swear to God I saw something move back into the tree line on the far side of the clearing, the opposite side from where I'd been searching. It was big, much bigger than a person, but moved with a weird, fluid grace that made my stomach drop. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds before it disappeared into the trees. I didn't stick around to investigate. I threw the truck in gear and got the hell out of there, that pine cone still sitting on the edge of my truck bed. It bounced off somewhere on the bumpy forest road on my way out, and I was glad to see it go. I've gone back and forth over the years about what happened that day. Was it a bear that somehow understood the concept of trade? Extremely unlikely. Some kind of elaborate prank by other hunters. Possible, but I hadn't seen any other vehicles for miles, and who would wait in freezing weather for the small chance I'd leave my truck to investigate a noise? What keeps me up at night is the deliberateness of it all. The sandwich wasn't knocked off or eaten messily nearby. It was taken completely, wrapper and all. And the pine cone was placed exactly where the sandwich had been, like whoever or whatever took my food understood the concept of exchange. That shows intelligence, planning, and comprehension that goes beyond animal behavior. I've heard stories since then about similar incidents in the Pacific Northwest. Items left in exchange for food, almost like a primitive form of trade. Most people laugh these stories off or call them Bigfoot tall tales. I never believed in that stuff before, and I'm still not sure what to believe now. I just know that something in those woods understood enough about human behavior to know that taking food deserved some kind of payment in return. I kept hunting for years afterward, but never went back to that specific clearing. Some places just give you a bad feeling, you know? And whoever or whatever was watching me that day, I'm pretty sure they're still out there, watching other hunters, maybe making their strange trades. The strangest part? That night when I finally got home and told my wife about it, she asked what I did with the pine cone. When I told her I'd lost it on the drive home, she seemed genuinely disappointed. "You should have kept it," she said. "It was a gift." Sometimes I still wonder if she was right. Was it a gift? A simple exchange? Or was something trying to communicate with me in the only way it knew how? I don't have answers even now, more than 40 years later. All I know is that something intelligent enough to understand the concept of trade was out in those woods that day. Something that wanted my sandwich and knew enough to leave something in return. Something that moved like no animal I've ever seen. And sometimes, on cold autumn days when the fog rolls in thick, I still feel like I'm being watched when I'm out in the woods. I just keep my lunch inside the cab of my truck now, and I never, ever leave it unattended. Story 2. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Most folks would think I'm just making up stories or that my memory's playing tricks on me after all these years. But I know what I saw. I was just a kid, 8 years old in the summer of '53. But some things you don't forget, no matter how much time passes. My grandfather was my hero. After my dad left, Grandpa stepped in and taught me everything I needed to know about the outdoors. He was quiet but wise, the kind of man who seemed to understand everything about the forest without anyone ever having to teach him. His hands were always rough from work, but gentle when he showed me how to bait a hook or clean a fish. That particular day in late September, we were headed out for salmon fishing on the Willapa River. It was the annual salmon run, and Grandpa had promised to teach me how to catch my own fish this year. I'd been looking forward to it for months. We lived just outside Raymond, Washington, in a small house my grandparents had built themselves back in the 30s. The woods behind our house seemed to go on forever. "Ready to catch dinner, Rosie?" Grandpa asked that morning. He always called me Rosie, even though my name is Margaret. Said I was as pretty as a rose when I was born. I remember jumping up and down in excitement. I'd gotten up extra early to put on my overalls and rubber boots. Grandpa had even whittled me my own fishing pole last Christmas, and I'd been practicing my cast in the backyard for weeks. The walk to our fishing spot took about an hour. Grandpa knew all the best places where the salmon would be thick in the water. It was a beautiful fall day, crisp but not too cold, with that smell in the air that only comes when the leaves are starting to turn. The forest was alive with sounds, birds calling, squirrels rushing through branches, and eventually the steady rush of the river getting louder as we approached. "Now remember what I taught you about patience," Grandpa said as we set up our spot. "Salmon don't just jump on your hook because you ask nicely." But actually, that day they practically did. The salmon run was especially good, and within an hour I'd caught my very first salmon all by myself. I remember the feeling of the line going tight, the way Grandpa coached me through reeling it in, and the pride on his face when we finally got it on shore. "That's a fine catch, Rosie, almost as big as mine," he'd said, though looking back, I think his was twice the size of my little fish. But that was Grandpa, always making me feel like I'd accomplished something amazing. By mid-afternoon, we each had our catch tied to a sturdy branch, mine on a smaller stick that Grandpa had cut just for me, and his 3 larger salmon on a thicker branch he carried over his shoulder. We were headed home, following the narrow path that wound through the densest part of the forest. I was walking ahead of Grandpa, skipping really, filled with excitement about showing Grandma my fish and having it for dinner. The path curved ahead, and I rounded the bend, humming to myself. That's when I saw them. I froze in my tracks. Not 20 feet ahead of me on the path stood something I'd never seen before. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my eyes were seeing something, but my mind couldn't process it. The creature was enormous, standing upright like a man, but much, much taller. It was covered in black hair, not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair that hung from its arms and shoulders. Its face was flat and wide, with deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge. And the smell, I'll never forget that smell, like wet dog and something earthier, musky and wild. The creature was holding something under one massive arm, half a deer carcass, still dripping blood onto the forest floor. Its other arm hung at its side, with fingers longer than my whole hand. But it wasn't alone. Beside it stood a smaller version of itself, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, still bigger than me, but obviously younger. They both stared at me with dark eyes that seemed too intelligent, too aware. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, clutching my fish-laden stick so tight my knuckles turned white. Several seconds passed before I remembered Grandpa was behind me. "Grandpa!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Then, louder, "Grandpa!" I heard his footsteps quicken behind me. "What is it, Rosie? Did you see a—" He stopped mid-sentence as he came around the bend. I glanced back to see his face go slack with surprise. He didn't look scared, though, more like astonished. The larger creature shifted its weight from one foot to the other. It made no sound, but its eyes moved from me to my grandfather, then to the fish I was carrying. Slowly, very slowly, my grandfather put his hand on my shoulder. "It's all right, Rosie," he said in a low, steady voice. "Don't make any sudden moves." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "What are they?" I whispered. Grandpa didn't answer right away. He just kept his hand on my shoulder, firm and reassuring. The smaller creature took a step forward, its eyes fixed on the salmon I was carrying. I clutched my fish tighter. "Rosie," Grandpa said softly, "I think you should give your fish to the little one." I looked up at him in disbelief. "But Grandpa, I caught it, it's mine." "I know, honey, but I think they're hungry." I looked back at the creatures. The smaller one had taken another step toward me, and I instinctively took a step back, moving closer to my grandfather. As I moved, something changed in the bigger creature's posture. It straightened up, seeming even taller than before, and made a low sound deep in its throat. Not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless. Grandpa's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly. "Rosie, stay close to me." The smaller creature was still approaching slowly, its eyes never leaving my fish. I was backing up, nearly pressed against my grandfather now, when he made a decision. In one smooth motion, Grandpa untied his own branch, heavy with 3 salmon. He held it out in front of him, then with a gentle, underhand toss, he threw the whole thing toward the smaller creature. I watched in amazement as the young creature caught the branch with reflexes faster than any human's. It immediately clutched the fish to its chest, making a soft, hooting sound. The larger creature, its parent I suppose, made a similar sound in response. Then, without warning, it turned toward the steep embankment to our right. It was practically a vertical wall of dirt and rock, at least 15 feet high. No human could climb it without ropes and gear. But these weren't human. The larger one tucked its deer carcass more securely under its arm, then placed one enormous hand against the embankment. With strength that seemed impossible, it pulled itself up, digging toes and fingers into the dirt for purchase. The smaller one followed, still clutching our salmon, using the same handholds, but moving even more nimbly. Within seconds, they had scaled the entire wall. At the top, they both paused and looked back down at us. The smaller one made that hooting sound again, almost like a thank you. Then they disappeared into the thick forest above. I stood there, still clutching my single fish, trembling from head to toe. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. "Well," Grandpa finally said, breaking the silence, "looks like we'll have one less salmon steak for dinner tonight." I turned to look at him, my eyes wide with disbelief. "Grandpa, what were those things?" He looked thoughtful, gazing at the spot where they'd disappeared. "There are things in these woods that most people don't know about, Rosie. Things that were here long before us and will be here long after. But they took our fish." I was still indignant, even through my fear. Grandpa chuckled softly and ruffled my hair. "They were hungry, and we have plenty. Your grandma has a garden full of vegetables, and there's bread she baked this morning. Those creatures have to hunt for every meal." "But why didn't you tell anyone about them? Why doesn't everyone know?" He started walking again, gently guiding me forward. "Some things are better left alone, Rosie. Those creatures don't bother us, and we don't bother them. That's the way it's been for generations." As we walked home, Grandpa explained that his own grandfather had seen the creatures too, back when the forests were even wilder. He called them by a different name, but nowadays people might call them Sasquatch or Bigfoot. He said they were rare and usually stayed deep in the woods, far away from people. "But why did they come so close to the path today?" I asked. "Probably the same reason we were out. Salmon run, easy food." When we got home, Grandma cooked up my fish, and we had a fine dinner. Grandpa told her we'd given away his catch to someone who needed it more, and she just nodded like that was a perfectly normal thing to do. Maybe for Grandpa, it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures, their intelligent eyes, their incredible strength as they climbed that wall. I kept wondering about them. Did they have a home somewhere? Did they talk to each other with those hooting sounds? The next morning, I asked Grandpa if we could go look for them again. He shook his head firmly. "No, Rosie. We leave them be. That's the deal." "What deal?" "The unspoken one. We share these woods, but we don't go looking for trouble. They showed themselves to you yesterday because they needed food. That doesn't mean they want to be found." I never saw them again, though I looked every time we went into the woods. As I grew older, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was just a child's overactive imagination or a dream that had seemed real. But Grandpa knew. Sometimes, when we'd be fishing or walking in the woods, he'd stop suddenly, his head tilted like he was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. He'd get a faraway look in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about them too. Grandpa's been gone for almost 30 years now. I'm an old woman myself, with grandchildren of my own. I've never told this story to anyone but my husband, who believed me because he knew I wasn't one for tall tales. I still live near Raymond, though not in my grandparents' old house. Sometimes I walk in those woods, following the old paths that Grandpa showed me. The Willapa River still runs strong during salmon season, and sometimes, when the forest is quiet and the light filters through the trees just right, I get the feeling I'm being watched. I never see anything, but I know they're still out there, living their lives parallel to ours, mostly unseen but very real. And whenever I catch fish these days, I always throw one back, not for conservation reasons, though that's what I tell people. It's for them, because some deals, even unspoken ones, need to be honored. Story 3. I've been sitting on this for almost 2 months now, thinking nobody would believe me. But I can't sleep properly, and my wife says I need to get this off my chest, so here goes. I worked for Arkansas Electric for 12 years, loved my job, climbing poles, fixing transformers, restoring power after storms, the whole package. I was good at it too. Never turned down overtime, night calls, holiday shifts, whatever. That all changed on October 3rd. It was getting dark early that evening, around 7 p.m, when dispatch called me about power lines acting up near the Saline County line outside Perrin. Not a full outage, but voltage fluctuations causing lights to flicker in about 30 homes. Nothing I hadn't fixed 100 times before. I arrived on site around 9 p.m. It was one of those rural stretches of road where streetlights don't exist, just thick woods on both sides, and maybe one house every half mile. I parked my truck on the shoulder and set up my portable work lights. The air was cool but not cold, and dead quiet except for some crickets. That silence should have been my first warning. After locating the problem, looked like a branch was occasionally touching the line when the wind picked up, I grabbed my tool belt and started prepping to climb. That's when I heard a thud about 10 feet away from me. At first, I thought maybe a branch had fallen. I walked over and saw it was a rock about the size of a softball. Weird, but not alarming. Maybe some local kid playing a prank. I shrugged it off and went back to my equipment. Not even a minute later, there was another louder thud. This rock was bigger, like a small bowling ball, and it actually rolled up to my boots. My heart started beating faster. This definitely wasn't a coincidence. "Hello?" I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the tree line. "Anybody there?" Nothing, just dead silence. Even the crickets had stopped. I'm not a small guy, 6'2", 220 pounds. And I've dealt with my share of hostile dogs, pissed-off homeowners, and even a few snakes over the years. But something felt very wrong. The hair on my arms stood up, and I got that feeling you get when you're being watched. I decided to move back toward my truck, just to be safe. That's when I heard rustling in the trees, maybe 150 feet away. Heavy rustling, like something big was moving. My flashlight caught a reflection, 2 eyes shining back at me. I froze. The eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground. Then it stepped forward, just enough for me to see its outline against the slightly less dark background of the forest. I've spent my whole life in Arkansas. I've seen bears, cougars, all kinds of wildlife. This was not a bear, not even close. It was massive, At least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Broad shoulders covered in dark hair or fur. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but still humanoid. Long arms, huge hands. But it was the way it moved that hit me hardest. Deliberate, intelligent. It took another step forward, and I could feel it staring right at me. People talk about fight or flight, but they forget the third response, freezing. That's what happened to me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My flashlight beam shook wildly as my hand trembled. The creature made this sound, not quite a growl, deeper than that, more like a rumble you feel in your chest. Then it took another step forward. That broke my trance. I dropped my tools and backed toward my truck, never taking my eyes off it. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them twice before getting the door open. The whole time, this thing just watched me, head tilted slightly like it was curious. I got into my truck, slammed the door, and locked it in one motion. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I cranked the high beams on. The creature was still there, just at the edge of where my lights reached. For a second that felt like forever, we just stared at each other. Then it did something that still gives me nightmares. It raised its arm and pointed at me, like it was singling me out, remembering me. I threw the truck in reverse, spinning the tires on the gravel shoulder, then shifted and gunned it down the road. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, maybe 5 miles away. I called my supervisor from a gas station, told him there was a situation and I couldn't complete the job. He was pissed, said I needed to go back. I refused, flat out refused. First time in 12 years I'd ever done that. I drove home in a daze. My wife said I looked like I'd seen a ghost when I walked in. I couldn't tell her what happened, couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I called in sick the next day, and the day after. By the third day, I knew I couldn't go back to that job. Not if it meant night calls in remote areas. I went in and quit. My supervisor thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. 2 weeks later, I was at the hardware store in Little Rock, when this older guy named David, who lives near me, struck up a conversation. Somehow we got on the topic of weird experiences in the woods. That's when he told me about how his neighbor had seen something similar near the Saline County line. Sasquatch, he said matter-of-factly, like he was talking about seeing a deer. They've been around these parts for generations. Nobody reports it because who wants to be the crazy Bigfoot guy? I nearly dropped the paint cans I was holding. I asked him more questions, trying to sound casual. He said there had been dozens of sightings over the years, especially near the power line clearings that cut through the forests. They use those clearings like highways, he told me, smart enough to stay hidden most of the time, but they don't like their territory being disturbed. That night, I finally told my wife. She didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. She just held my hand and asked if that's why I quit my job. I nodded. I'm working construction now. Better hours, no night shifts. The pay's not as good, but I sleep better. Well, most nights. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those eyes on me, remembering how it pointed at me, like it was making a promise. The weird thing is, I called a buddy who still works at the electric company. Asked him if they ever fixed those lines near the Saline County line. He said when another crew went out the next morning, there was nothing wrong with them. Everything was working perfectly fine. What keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's the thought that it wanted me there. That those rocks weren't warnings, they were bait. And I almost took it. I've lived in Arkansas my whole life, spent countless hours in those woods hunting and fishing. I thought I knew every creature that called these forests home. I was wrong. I don't go into the woods anymore, not even in daylight, and every time I drive past a dark stretch of trees, I catch myself looking at the tree line, wondering if something is looking back. I don't expect anyone to believe this. Hell, some mornings I wake up and don't believe it myself. But then I remember those eyes, that deliberate finger pointing at me, and I know what I saw was real. And I know I'm never going back to that stretch of road again. Story 4. I still wake up some nights hearing those sounds. Not quite human, not quite animal. It's been over 40 years now, but January 1981 is burned into my brain like it happened yesterday. I was 17 then, living in Chesterfield, this tiny speck of a town in Bannock County, Idaho. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, where the nearest movie theater was a 40-minute drive, and where winter meant finding your own entertainment. That winter was particularly harsh. Snow had been piling up since November, and by mid-January, cabin fever was hitting all of us hard. My friends and I, there were 5 of us total, decided to go skating on the Pontiff River, which had frozen solid near Old Man Cooch's ranch. We'd done it dozens of times before. It was just something to do, you know, get out of the house, mess around, maybe share a couple beers someone's older brother had bought. It was January 14th. I remember the date exactly because it was my mom's birthday, and I'd promised to be back by 6 for her dinner. The temperature was hovering around 10 degrees, and the sky was that pale winter blue that hurts your eyes when you look at it too long. We parked our trucks about a quarter mile from the river, trudging through knee-deep snow, with our skates slung over our shoulders. Tommy had brought a small radio, and we could hear the faint sounds of REO Speedwagon as we made our way through the trees. The river bend near Cooch's property was perfect for skating, wide, flat and sheltered from the wind by a thicket of pines on one side and a slight ridge on the other. When we got there around 2 p.m., the ice was pristine. No one else had been there yet, which wasn't surprising. Most folks in town were working, and the high school kids were still in class. We'd all called in sick that day. For about an hour, everything was normal. We skated, pushed each other around, tried to do tricks and mostly failed. Mike had brought a hockey stick and puck, so we set up makeshift goals using our backpacks and played a 3-on-2 game. I remember being warm despite the cold, sweating under my layers as we raced across the ice. It was during a break, when we were all catching our breath at the edge of the ice, that I first felt something was off. The woods had gone quiet, like unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. Just the sound of our breathing and Tommy's radio, which now seemed too loud. "Turn that down," I said. "What? Why?" Tommy asked, but he did it anyway. "You hear that?" Mike said. "Hear what?" Jess replied. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," I said. "It's too quiet." We all stood there for a moment, and I remember the hair on my arms standing up despite my thick coat. Then we heard it, a crack of branches from the pine thicket across the river. "Probably just a deer," Kevin said, but he didn't sound convinced. We all stared at the tree line. The sun was already starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ice. Then we saw movement among the trees. At first I honestly thought it was a bear. We'd seen them occasionally, though they should have been hibernating, but as it moved to the edge of the trees, I realized it was standing upright, and it was big, really big. "What the hell is that?" Jess whispered. None of us answered. We were all frozen, watching as this thing stepped partially out from the tree line. It's hard to describe it accurately even now. It was huge. I'd guess around 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted hair, like a bear, but not quite. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It had a massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, and a hunched posture. But it was standing on 2 legs and moving in a way that was disturbingly human-like. For maybe 10 seconds, it just stood there at the edge of the trees, swaying slightly. Then it took another step forward, and I could see its face better. God, that face. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. The face was flat and wide, with deep-set eyes that I swear to this day were watching us with intelligence. Its mouth was a dark slash across its lower face, and when it opened it, I could see teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Now! No one argued. We started backing away slowly, still facing the creature. It tilted its head, watching us, and then it did something that makes my blood run cold even thinking about it now. It reached down and picked up what looked like a broken tree branch about 4 feet long. It was using a tool, a weapon. Then it made a sound. Not a growl or a roar, but a series of yells that started low and rose in pitch. They echoed across the frozen river, bouncing off the ice and the surrounding hills. It was communicating something. Anger, territory, warning. I don't know, but it was purposeful. That's when we broke. We turned and ran, stumbling on our skates across the uneven snow at the river's edge. I fell once, scrambling back up with snow shoved up my coat sleeve and down my collar. I didn't even feel the cold. The adrenaline was pumping so hard I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. "It's coming!" Kevin shouted from behind me, and I made the mistake of looking back. The thing was crossing the river, not running, but moving with purpose, taking long strides across the ice, still holding that makeshift club. It wasn't slipping or sliding at all. It moved like it knew exactly what it was doing. We reached the path back to our trucks, and that's when I realized we'd left our boots at the riverbank. We were still wearing our skates, trying to run through snow. Mike realized it too, and stopped to frantically unlace his. "Leave them!" I yelled. "Just go!" We half ran, half hobbled up that path, the guards on our skate blades digging into the snow and tripping us up. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. The image of that thing coming across the ice, moving with that strange rolling gait, is branded into my brain. I don't know how, but we made it back to our trucks. Tommy had the keys to his dad's pickup, and we all piled in, not even bothering to take off our skates. He started it up just as we heard another of those yells, closer now. The thing had followed us up the path. "Go, go, go!" Jess was screaming, and Tommy floored it, tires spinning in the snow before finally catching. We fishtailed onto the road and took off, skidding around corners, nobody saying a word except for gasping directions back to town. We ended up at Mike's house because his parents were both at work. We sat in his kitchen, still wearing our skates, too shocked to even take them off right away. Nobody wanted to say at first. "What the hell was that?" Kevin finally asked. "A bear," Tommy said, but it sounded hollow even to him. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs like that," I said. "They don't use clubs." "Bigfoot," Jess suggested, trying to make it sound like a joke, but nobody laughed. We sat there for about an hour, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Eventually we had to leave. I made it home just in time for my mum's birthday dinner and somehow managed to act normal, though I must have seemed distracted. I didn't tell my parents. What would I say? That we'd seen a monster. They'd think we were high or pulling a prank, but the next morning the whole town was talking about it. Apparently, we weren't the only ones who'd seen the thing. A couple of Cooch's ranch hands had spotted it too, near the western range. They were calling it a Sasquatch. My dad came home from the general store with the news that a search party was being organized. 20 men, all with hunting rifles, were going to go looking for whatever it was. Dad was going to join them. "It's probably just a bear," he said, checking his rifle. "But people are spooked, and if it's aggressive, it needs to be dealt with." I wanted to tell him then what I'd seen, that it wasn't a bear, that it had used a weapon, that the sound it made was like nothing I'd ever heard before. But I couldn't get the words out. It sounded crazy even in my head. The search party left around noon. I spent the day pacing around the house, jumping at every sound, waiting for news. My friends and I called each other on our home phones, speaking in hushed tones about what we'd seen, comparing details, trying to convince ourselves it was something explainable. At some point that afternoon, I decided I needed to see the tracks for myself. I know it was stupid, but I had to know if what I'd seen was real. I told my mum I was going to Kevin's, grabbed my coat, and headed out. But I didn't go to Kevin's. I went back to where we'd parked the day before. I wasn't going all the way to the river. I wasn't that crazy, but I thought maybe the thing had left tracks in the area when it chased us. The day was overcast, threatening more snow, and the temperature had dropped. The road to Cooch's ranch was deserted. I parked in the same spot as yesterday and sat in my truck for a long time, working up the courage to get out. Finally, I did, making sure to lock the doors behind me. The snow along the path had been trampled by the search party earlier, but as I walked a little way in, staying within sight of my truck, I spotted something off to the side, an area they hadn't gone through. There were tracks there, partially filled in with the light snow that had fallen overnight but still visible. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering. They were huge, easily 22 inches long and about 7 inches wide, too big for a bear, too big for a human, and there was something else strange about them. They only showed 4 toes, not 5 like a human, not the paw print of a bear, 4 distinct toe impressions at the front of a massive foot. I stood there staring at those tracks, and suddenly all the fear from yesterday came rushing back. This thing was real. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a guy in a suit. It was something else. I was so focused on the tracks that I almost didn't hear it. A soft crunching of snow somewhere in the trees to my right. I froze, not daring to move. The sound came again, closer this time. That's when I ran. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbling with the keys, nearly dropping them in the snow. I got the door open and threw myself inside, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole time I was watching the tree line, expecting to see that massive hair-covered form emerge. I don't know if it was actually there. I never saw it. Maybe it was just an animal or a branch falling with snow. But I wasn't taking any chances. I got that truck started and took off, driving way too fast on the icy roads back to town. When I got home, the search party had returned. They hadn't found anything except tracks similar to what I'd seen. No creature, no lair, nothing. Some of the men were talking about going out again the next day with more people, maybe bringing dogs, but they never did find it. After a few days, people started saying it must have moved on, maybe heading deeper into the mountains as the weather changed. The story made it into the Deseret News. A reporter from Pocatello came out to interview people who'd seen it. They called it a Sasquatch in the paper, and after a while, that's what everyone in town settled on too. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could. My friends and I never went skating on the Pontneuf again. I don't think any of the local kids did for years. We didn't talk about what we'd seen much after that winter, not even among ourselves. It was like we all silently agreed to try and forget it. But here's the thing. About a week after the sighting, I was helping my dad clear snow from our driveway when I found something stuck in the snow by our woodpile. It was a stick, about 2 feet long, that had been stripped of its bark and shaped at one end to form a crude point, like a spear. It wasn't something that would happen naturally. Someone or something had made it. I never told anyone about finding that stick. I threw it as far as I could into the woods behind our house and tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence that some kid had made it while playing and left it there. But sometimes, especially on cold winter nights, when the wind makes those low, moaning sounds through the trees, I still think about what we saw that day on the Pontneuf, about those tracks with only 4 toes, about that deliberate, intelligent look in its eyes as it watched us from across the ice, about the way it picked up that club, and I wonder if it's still out there somewhere in the Idaho wilderness, watching and waiting, because whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It was thinking, it was planning, and that's what scares me most of all. Story 5. I've never told this story online before. For years, I couldn't even talk about it without breaking down. It happened in 1981 when I was 13, and to this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that evening on our farm. We lived in rural Pennsylvania on about 40 acres of land that backed up against dense woods. Our nearest neighbors were about a mile down the dirt road. It was just me, my little sister Roxanne, my parents, and our cousin David, who lived with us after his parents died in a car accident. We were pretty self-sufficient with our vegetable garden, chickens, and a small herd of goats. That summer had been weird from the start. Our animals had been acting strange, jumpy and nervous. Mom and Dad kept talking in hushed voices about missing feed and damaged fences that my dad would have to fix almost weekly. Our dog, Max, this big German shepherd who wasn't scared of anything, started refusing to go near the tree line at night. He'd stand at the edge of our yard, hackles raised, growling at something none of us could see. Around June or July, Mr. Peterson, who owned the farm next to ours, came over looking super upset. His barn door had been completely ripped off the hinges, not just broken or damaged, literally torn off. Dad and our cousin David went to look at it, and when they came back, they both seemed shaken. David kept saying it would take something unbelievably strong to do that kind of damage. We started hearing weird noises at night, not like coyotes or bears or anything normal for our area. These were different. Sometimes it sounded like weird whooping calls, other times like wood knocking against wood deep in the forest. Mom would just say it was the wind, or probably some hunters, but I could tell nobody really believed that. By August, my parents had established a new rule. Nobody goes outside alone after dusk, and definitely nobody goes near the woods. They never explained why, but us kids could feel the tension. Something was off. The night it happened was August 23rd. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before I was supposed to start 8th grade. We'd had a hot day, and evening chores had gotten delayed because Dad's truck broke down on his way home from work, and Mom had to go pick him up. Around 7:30 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set, Mum realized nobody had fed the goats or collected the last of the eggs from the chicken coop. Dad was still working on his truck, and Mom was making dinner. David was in the shower after spending all day helping a neighbor bale hay. "Tina," my mom called from the kitchen, "can you and Roxanne go do the evening feed real quick? Just stick together and come right back." Roxanne was only 9 then, and she hated going to the barn when it was getting dark. I wasn't exactly thrilled either, but I tried to act brave for her sake. "It's fine, Roxy," I said, grabbing the egg basket. "We'll be super quick." We headed out across the yard toward the barn, which sat about 200 feet from our house. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air felt heavy and still in that weird way it gets before a storm, though the sky was clear. As we got closer to the barn, I noticed something odd. The barn door, which Dad always kept latched shut, was slightly open. Just a few inches, but enough to notice. "Did Dad leave it open earlier?" Roxanne asked, grabbing my hand. "Maybe," I said, though I was pretty sure he hadn't. We slowed down as we approached. That's when I noticed Max was following us, but he stopped about halfway between the house and barn. He sat down, whining softly, refusing to come any closer. "Max, come on, boy," I called, but he just whined louder. That should have been our first clue to turn around. When we got to the barn door, I hesitated. The inside was pitch black, the darkest I'd ever seen it. Usually some light filtered through the windows, but tonight it looked like a cave. "I don't want to go in," Roxanne whispered, squeezing my hand so tight it hurt. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'll go first and hit the light switch. You wait right here." She nodded, relief flooding her face as she stepped back a few paces. The light switch was just inside the door on the right wall. I'd turned it on 1,000 times before. No big deal, right? I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The smell hit me first. A strong, musty odor I'd never smelled in our barn before. Kind of like wet dog, but way worse, mixed with something rotten. The air felt different inside too, warmer and somehow heavier. I reached out toward where the light switch should be, feeling along the wall. My fingers brushed against something soft. Fur. I assumed it was one of our goats that had somehow gotten loose. "Hey, buddy," I whispered. "How'd you get out?" I patted the fur again, but something wasn't right. The fur felt coarser than our goats, and whatever I was touching was warm, really warm, and solid like a wall, and it was way too tall to be a goat. That's when I realized I wasn't touching the wall at all. My hand froze. The wall moved slightly under my touch. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from above my head, way above my head. My eyes had adjusted just enough to the darkness that I could make out a massive silhouette. It was huge, taller than my dad, taller than anyone I'd ever seen, and it was covered in dark fur. The outline showed broad shoulders, a head that nearly touched our 8-foot barn ceiling, and arms that hung down unnaturally long. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, my hand still resting against its fur, as if moving would trigger whatever this thing was to attack. The growl came again, deeper this time, and I felt it vibrate through my hand. Some survival instinct kicked in, and I slowly, very slowly, took one step backward. "Roxanne," I whispered as quietly as I could. "Run to the house. Now." "Tina?" Her voice sounded tiny and scared from the doorway. "Run!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Go get Dad and David!" I heard her footsteps as she took off, and that's when the creature moved. It shifted toward the door, toward me, and I could smell its breath, like meat gone bad. I backed up slowly, step by step, never taking my eyes off the massive shadow, even though I couldn't see details in the darkness. Just the hulking shape, blacker than the blackness around it. When I reached the door, I made the mistake of turning to run. That's when it let out a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between, like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, feel the ground vibrating. Whatever it was following me. Roxanne was already at the house, screaming for help. I saw the porch light flip on, and then David burst through the door. He had his shotgun, the old 16-gauge his dad had given him before he died. "Get down, Tina!" he yelled. I dove to the ground, covering my head with my arms. I heard David pump the shotgun, then the deafening blast as he fired into the air. Boom! The sound echoed across our property. Then came another shot. Boom! I looked up to see the creature had stopped about 50 feet from me. In the dim light from the house, I could finally see it clearly. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, covered in black fur, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its face was hard to make out in the shadows, but I could see glinting eyes reflecting the porch light, set deep in a face that seemed somewhere between ape and human. For a second, nobody moved. The creature, David with his gun, me on the ground, my parents and Roxanne at the door. We all just froze in this terrible moment. Then David fired a third shot, and the creature turned and ran, not like a person running, but in this weird loping gait that ate up ground incredibly fast. It headed straight for the woods, making these bizarre whooping noises as it disappeared into the trees. My dad ran out and practically carried me back to the house. Mom was hysterical, checking me for injuries while Roxanne sobbed in the corner. David kept the shotgun aimed at the woods for what felt like hours, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that thing?" Dad kept asking, though I don't think he expected an answer. David finally lowered the gun and looked at us. "That was a Sasquatch. Had to be. Nothing else that big stands on 2 legs. Mom started saying he was crazy, that there had to be another explanation, but David cut her off. "Aunt Linda, I saw it clear as day. Unbelievably big. 6, maybe 7 feet tall. Arms hanging down to here," he gestured to his knees, "covered in black fur. That wasn't a bear. That wasn't a person in a suit. I know what I saw." That night, none of us slept. Dad and David took turns keeping watch with the shotgun. The next morning, they went out to check the barn. and found massive footprints in the soft dirt around it, easily twice the size of my dad's boots. They also found 3 of our feed barrels completely emptied, the lids twisted off and thrown aside. Mum finally admitted that wasn't the first time something had gotten into our barn. For months, they'd been finding feed missing, water troughs emptied. The torn fences weren't just breaking from age. Something had been pulling them apart. We called the sheriff, but he just laughed it off, said it was probably a black bear, even though bears don't stand 7 feet tall on 2 legs or have arms that hang to their knees. For weeks afterward, we heard those weird calls from the woods at night, whoops and howls that made Max go crazy. Dad installed better locks on the barn and floodlights all around our property. David started keeping his shotgun loaded all the time. The weird thing is, after about a month, the noises stopped. The feed stayed in the barrels. The fences remained intact. It was like whatever it was just moved on. We never talked about it outside our family. In a small town like ours, you don't tell people you saw a Sasquatch unless you want to be the laughingstock of the county. But I know what I felt that night. I know what I saw. I'm 55 years old now, and I've never touched anything like that fur again. Never smelled that specific smell, never heard those sounds. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can feel that coarse fur against my fingertips and hear that deep growl that seemed to come from something impossibly large. I still don't go into barns alone at night. Some fears you just never outgrow. Story 6. I've been driving logging trucks in British Columbia for nearly 22 years now, and I've seen just about everything these mountains have to offer. Moose, bears, cougars, you name it. But what happened to me last month has kept me up at night, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. It was a Thursday in late October. The weather had been strange all week, unseasonably warm with this weird fog that would roll in suddenly and then disappear just as quick. I was hauling a full load of timber from a cutting site near Mount Robson. My 2007 Kenworth T800 was handling the weight fine. That 500 horsepower cat engine can pull through just about anything, but I was taking it slow on the back roads. I remember checking my watch around 4:15 p.m. The sun was already getting low, casting these long shadows through the trees. I had the radio off that day, which isn't normal for me. Usually I've got it blasting, but something about the quietness of the forest had me wanting to keep it that way. The road I was on is a nightmare, barely wide enough for a truck, with these hairpin turns that force you to inch around at a crawl. I was coming up on one of the worst turns, about 30 miles from the main highway. It's this sharp bend that hugs the mountainside, with a steep drop-off to the right and nothing but rock wall to the left. Every driver who runs this route knows it. We call it prayer corner, because you're always praying nothing's coming the other way when you round it. I downshifted and slowed to maybe 10 mph, watching my trailer in the mirrors to make sure it wasn't getting too close to the edge. That's when I first got this feeling, like something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no nothing, just the rumble of my engine and the creak of the timber behind me. I was halfway through the turn when I had to slam on my brakes so hard that my load shifted. My heart was pounding as I fought to keep the truck from jackknifing. When everything settled, I was sitting there, knuckles white around the steering wheel, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Standing directly in front of my truck, so close I could have touched it if I'd reached through my windshield, was what I can only describe as a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I'd have called them crazy or drunk or both, but there it was, plain as day. This thing was massive. The top of my Kenworth's cab sits about 8 feet off the ground, and this creature was clearly taller, I'd guess 9-10 feet at least. It was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in some places, with a face that was, I don't know how to describe it exactly, not quite human, not quite ape. Its eyes were deep set, and I swear to God, they looked intelligent. I sat there frozen, engine idling, afraid to move. The creature didn't seem aggressive, just alert. It was staring directly at me through the windshield. I couldn't tell if it was curious or warning me off. Its chest was enormous, probably 3 times the width of mine, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, it did something bizarre. It raised its arms and started waving them in this strange pattern, almost like it was mimicking a bird flying, up and down, side to side. It wasn't random. There was a clear pattern to it. I remember thinking it looked like it was trying to communicate something. That's when things got even weirder. I heard rustling from the trees to my left, and 2 smaller figures emerged onto the road. They were clearly the same species. Same hair, same features, but much smaller, maybe 4 feet tall. They moved identically, like twins, and they approached the large one without any fear. The big one, I assume it was male, though I couldn't tell you why, stopped its arm movements immediately. It turned to the little ones and made this soft grunting sound that carried easily through my closed windows. The little ones moved faster, almost scampering up to the big one. In one smooth motion, the adult Sasquatch leaned down, scooped up both of the young ones, one under each arm, and turned toward the right side of the road. It moved with this weird grace that seemed impossible for something so large. 3 steps and it was at the tree line. It never looked back at me, just disappeared into the forest with the 2 young ones. I sat there for probably 5 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. My CB radio crackled, making me jump so bad I hit my head on the roof of the cab. "You all right up there, Tom? You've been stopped a while." It was Mike Peterson in his Peterbilt. He'd been about 10 minutes behind me all day. I remember my voice shaking when I responded, Yeah, I'm here. Just had to stop for a minute." "Saw something strange up ahead," Mike said, his voice sounding odd over the radio. "Thought my eyes were playing tricks on me." My blood went cold. "What'd you see, Mike?" There was a long pause. "You tell me what you saw first." We met up at the truck stop about an hour later. I was still shaking when I walked into the diner. Mike was sitting in a booth at the back, staring into a cup of coffee, like it held all the answers in the universe. He looked up when I sat down, and I could tell immediately he'd seen the same thing I had. "It was big," he said quietly, before I could even speak. "Bigger than anything I've ever seen in these woods." "With 2 little ones," I added. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, 2 little ones." We talked for hours that night, comparing details, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Mike had been far enough back that he saw the whole thing play out. The big Sasquatch in the road, the arm waving, the little ones appearing, and then all 3 disappearing into the forest. His description matched mine perfectly. We agreed not to tell anyone right away. Who'd believe us? 2 logging truck drivers claiming they saw Bigfoot? We'd be laughed out of every bar in BC. But the experience kept eating at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. I kept seeing those eyes, intelligent and aware, looking right through me. After a week, I called Jim Chang, who runs the local wildlife society. Jim and I go way back. We used to fish together every summer before his kids were born. I figured if anyone would take me seriously, it'd be him. We met at his office, and I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh, just listened carefully and took notes. "And you're absolutely certain about what you saw?" he asked when I finished. "Jim, I've been driving these roads for over 2 decades. I know every animal in these mountains. This wasn't a bear standing up, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I've ever seen before, and Mike saw it too, exactly the same." I could tell he was skeptical, but then I mentioned something I'd forgotten earlier. There had been tracks. In the soft mud at the edge of the road, right where the creature had entered the forest with the young ones. I hadn't gotten out to examine them. Honestly, I was too scared to leave my truck, but they had to still be there. Jim agreed to go out to the site with me the next day. We drove out in his Jeep, and I showed him exactly where it happened. The tracks were still visible, though they'd been partially washed away by a light rain we'd had 2 days before, but they were clearly there, massive indentations in the mud, easily 18 inches long and broader than any human foot. Jim took photos and measurements, his face getting more serious by the minute. He made casts of the best prints and collected some hairs that were caught on a low-hanging branch right where the creature had entered the forest. That was 3 weeks ago. Jim called me yesterday to say the hair samples didn't match any known wildlife in the region. The DNA testing was inconclusive. Apparently the samples were contaminated or degraded somehow. But they definitely weren't from a bear, deer, or any other common forest animal. I still drive that route regularly. It's part of my job. But now I slow down even more at Prayer Corner, and I find myself scanning the tree line constantly. Mike does too. We've talked about it a few times since, but mostly we've stopped discussing it. What else is there to say? We saw what we saw. The thing that sticks with me most isn't how big it was, or how it moved, or even those young ones that looked so vulnerable. It's those arm movements, that deliberate pattern, like it was trying to tell me something important. Sometimes I dream about it, those massive arms moving in that strange, flying pattern, and I wake up feeling like I missed something crucial, some message I was supposed to understand. I've been in these forests my whole life, but now I look at them differently. The trees seem deeper somehow, the shadows darker. I keep thinking about that family, because that's what they were, a family, moving through the wilderness, staying hidden, watching us encroach further into their territory year after year. What were they doing on that road that day? Was it a coincidence, or did they want to be seen? And why by me? These questions keep circling in my head, and I don't have answers for any of them. All I know is what I saw. A 9-foot-tall Sasquatch standing in front of my Kenworth, 2 little ones that came when called, and all 3 disappearing into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. Mike saw it too. The tracks were real. The hair was real. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But it happened, exactly as I've described it. And now, every time I drive through those mountains with a load of timber, I can't help but wonder who's watching me from the trees. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about that summer night in 1978. I was 11 years old, staying with my dad at his logging camp near Detroit Lake in Marion County. It's been over 40 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Dad worked as a foreman for Pacific Timber, and that summer I begged him to let me come along for a few days during my school break. Mom wasn't thrilled about me staying at a filthy logging camp full of roughnecks, as she put it. But Dad promised he'd keep an eye on me. Looking back, I think he was just lonely and wanted the company. My parents had separated earlier that year, and these weekend visits were becoming our thing. The camp itself was nothing fancy, just a collection of small cabins for the crew, a mess hall, equipment sheds, and a clearing where they parked the trucks and machinery. Our cabin was one of the smaller ones, with just enough room for 2 cots, a small table, and Dad's footlocker. The walls were thin, and you could hear everything. The men snoring in the cabins next door, the owls hooting in the trees, even the occasional deer walking through camp. That night, we'd had a big cookout. Bill, the camp cook, had brought out a huge cooler filled with steaks, chicken, and a massive beef roast he was saving for Sunday dinner. There were also some veggies, fruits, and beers, though Dad made sure I stuck to soda. The cooler stayed outside near the main fire pit after everyone turned in, since it was too big to fit in the mess hall fridge, and Bill said the night was cool enough to keep everything fresh. I remember going to bed tired, but happy. Dad had let me stay up late with the men, listening to their stories about logging accidents, bar fights, and, my favorite, encounters with strange things in the woods. Oregon loggers have a million stories about weird stuff they've seen, and I soaked it all up. One guy, Pete, Had everyone spooked with his tale about strange howls he'd heard the previous month that weren't any animal I know? Another guy claimed he'd seen massive footprints crossing a muddy access road after a rainstorm. Dad just rolled his eyes at all this. "Don't fill her head with that nonsense," he'd said, but I could tell he was enjoying it too. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and Dad's gentle snoring from the other cot. The cabin was warm, and I'd kicked off my sleeping bag, just using it as a blanket over my legs. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. We didn't have a clock in the cabin, and this was way before cell phones. But it was the middle of the night for sure. The moon was high and bright, casting silver light through our small window. What woke me was a noise. Not loud, but distinct. A sort of rhythmic sound, like someone carefully moving things around. At first, I thought it might be raccoons getting into the trash again. They'd been a problem earlier in the week, but this sounded more deliberate. There was a measured quality to it that didn't seem animal-like. Dad was still sound asleep. He always slept like a rock after a few beers, and I knew from experience that short of shaking him violently, he wouldn't wake up. I sat up in bed, listening harder. The sound continued, a soft thud, a pause, another soft thud. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the fire pit and the cooler. Now, I wish I could say I was a brave kid who boldly went to investigate, but the truth is I was scared. I sat there for what felt like forever, straining my ears and trying to convince myself it was nothing. But curiosity eventually won out. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the wooden floor with a quiet creak. I tiptoed to the window first, trying to see what was happening outside, but the angle was wrong. All I could see were shadows and the edge of the clearing. Our cabin door had a simple latch, and I remember the feel of the cold metal under my fingers as I carefully lifted it. The hinges squeaked slightly as I opened the door just enough to peek out. The night air hit me, cool and pine-scented, making me shiver in my thin pajamas, just a t-shirt and cotton shorts. At first, all I saw were the dark shapes of the other cabins, the dying embers of the evening's fire, and the massive silhouettes of the Douglas firs surrounding the camp. Then my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, and I saw the cooler. The lid was open, and something, was bent over it. My brain didn't process what I was seeing right away. The figure was big, much bigger than any of the loggers. It was standing upright but hunched over the cooler, its back to me. I remember thinking it must be one of the men, maybe wrapped in a blanket or wearing a bulky coat, though that made no sense in July. Then it straightened up and turned slightly, and I saw it in profile. It wasn't human, not even close. The creature stood at least 6.5 feet tall, towering over my dad, who was 6 feet even. It was covered in dark hair, long and shaggy on some parts of its body, shorter on others. In the moonlight, the hair looked reddish-brown, like rust or old blood. But it wasn't just some bear standing upright. Its proportions were all wrong for that, too slender, too human-like. What struck me most was that it was female. I can't explain how I knew that instantly, but I did. There was something about the shape of it, the way it moved, that was distinctly feminine despite its massive size and strength. She had breasts, partially covered by the long hair that hung down her chest, but visible enough that even an 11-year-old girl could recognize another female. And she was holding the meat. The big beef roast that Bill had been saving was tucked neatly under her arm, wrapped in the butcher paper it had come in. She was holding it carefully, almost delicately, like someone who'd just picked out a nice cut at the grocery store. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind 1,000,000 times. She turned her head and saw me standing in the doorway. Our eyes met. Hers were dark, deep-set under a heavy brow, but alert and intelligent. There was no aggression there, just awareness. Recognition, even. I had the strangest feeling she was just as surprised to see me as I was to see her. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds, we stared at each other. I wasn't breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I noticed details that seem impossible to have registered in that moment. The way her nostrils flared slightly as she seemed to sniff the air, the massive hands with fingers that looked jointed like ours but were much longer, the slight tilt of her head as she regarded me. The cooler was still open beside her. I could see it was neatly organized inside. The vegetables and fruits were untouched, still arranged as Bill had left them. Only the meat was being taken, and she'd selected it without disturbing anything else. The cooler lid was propped open normally, using the built-in plastic stopper. She hadn't ripped it off or broken it. She'd opened it like a person would. Then something in me snapped. I screamed. Not a small yelp or gasp, but a full-throated scream of terror that ripped through the quiet night and echoed off the surrounding forest. I couldn't help it. It was pure instinct, the kind of primal fear response you can't control. The creature reacted instantly. She didn't drop the meat or make any threatening move toward me. Instead, she turned and loped away with remarkable speed, still clutching the roast under her arm. Her movement was fluid, powerful, not quite running like a human would, but not on all fours either. More of a bent-forward, long-strided gait that ate up ground with terrifying efficiency. My scream did what it was meant to do. It woke the camp. Dad jumped up so fast he got tangled in his sleeping bag and fell to the floor. Doors banged open all around as men emerged from their cabins. Most in their underwear, some holding axes or other tools as weapons. "What? What is it?" Dad was shouting, trying to get to me while still half trapped in his bedding. I couldn't speak. I was pointing frantically toward the woods, where the creature had disappeared. By now I was crying, big gulping sobs that made it impossible to get words out. Dad finally got free and rushed to me, grabbing my shoulders. "Are you hurt? What happened?" His face was white with fear, his eyes scanning me for injuries. Something, I finally managed. Something took the meat." The men were all awake now, gathering around, asking questions all at once. Bill had made it to the cooler and was looking inside. "The roast is gone," he confirmed, looking confused, "and looks like most of the steaks too." "What did you see, girl?" One of the older loggers, Mac, knelt down to my eye level, his voice gentle but urgent. "Was it a bear?" I shook my head vehemently. No, it was standing up, like a person, but not a person. It was huge and hairy and it was a she." That got some nervous laughter from a few of the men, but Dad and Mac didn't laugh. They exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "How big?" Mac asked. I raised my hand well above my dad's head. "Taller than Daddy. Way taller." Bill had walked over to the edge of the clearing where the creature had disappeared. "Guys," he called, his voice strange, "you better come look at this." Everyone moved toward him, Dad picking me up even though I was too big for that, really. I clung to him anyway, my face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar smell of his aftershave mixed with wood chips. In the soft dirt at the edge of the camp were footprints. Even in the dim light, they were unmistakable. Huge impressions that dwarfed the men's bare feet standing around them. They were feet, 5-toed like ours, but massive, easily 14 inches long, maybe more. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "It's just a bear," another voice said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Mac knelt by one of the prints, his gnarled hand hovering over it but not touching. "No bear made this," he said quietly. "This here's a Sasquatch print, plain as day." A ripple went through the group of men. I felt Dad's arms tighten around me. "That's enough of that talk," he said sharply. "You'll scare her more." But I wasn't scared anymore, at least not in the same way. I wiggled until Dad put me down, and I approached the footprint, staring at it in wonder. It was like a human foot, but bigger and wider with a different arch. Something about seeing that print made the encounter real in a new way. Not just a terrifying nighttime vision, but something solid and provable. "She didn't break anything," I said, looking back at the cooler. "She opened it normal, and she only took the meat, not the other stuff." Bill nodded slowly. That's right. Lid's fine, and all the fruits and veggies are still there, arranged just like I left them. No one seemed to know what to do next. A few men wanted to follow the tracks with flashlights, but Dad and Mac vetoed that idea. Whatever it was, it's long gone now, Dad said firmly, and I'm not having anyone get lost in those woods at night. Mac agreed. Nothing good comes from chasing something through the forest in the dark. We all went back to our cabins eventually, but I don't think anyone slept much. Dad let me climb into his cot with him, something he hadn't done since I was little. I lay there listening to his heartbeat, still too wired to sleep. Dad, I whispered. It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it? He was quiet for so long, I thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he sighed. I don't know, sweetheart, I really don't. But whatever it was, it didn't hurt you, and that's all that matters to me. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, some of the men tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear that had learned to walk upright. Maybe it was some homeless person living in the woods. Maybe I'd been dreaming and sleepwalked to the door, only seeing a regular thief who'd been scared off by my scream. But the footprints were still there, deep and unmistakable. Several of the men took photos with their cameras, and Mac even made a cast of one print using some quick-dry cement mix from the supply shed. I remember the way the men gathered around that plaster cast when it was dry, passing it from hand to hand, their faces troubled and fascinated. We stayed at the camp 2 more days, and nothing else happened. But things were different. The men went about their work in groups, not alone. They kept their voices down at night and turned in early. The cooler was brought inside the mess hall, and no one, not even the biggest skeptics, wandered too far into the woods by themselves. Dad and I never really talked about it again after that weekend. I think he wanted to protect me from becoming that weird Sasquatch girl at school, but sometimes, years later, I'd catch him looking at me with a curious expression, and I knew he was remembering too. I'm 54 now, with kids and even grandkids of my own. I've told this story to very few people over the years, but I know what I saw that night. I know those intelligent eyes that met mine, that deliberate care in how she opened the cooler and selected only what she wanted. It wasn't some mindless animal. There was a person in there, not human, but a person nonetheless. Sometimes I wonder if she tells her own version of this story, about the night she found an easy meal at the edge of the human camp, only to be discovered by a small female who made a terrible noise. Maybe she even wonders about me, the way I've wondered about her all these years. Story 8. I still can't believe it's been 4 months since old Henry passed away. Sometimes I catch myself looking down the dirt road to see if his beaten-up truck might come bouncing along for an unexpected visit. The locals around here called him crazy, but I knew better. We'd formed an unlikely friendship these past few years. Me, a wildlife researcher who moved up here for the solitude, and him, possibly the oldest man in 3 counties. I'm writing this down now because I promised him I would. Tell my story when I'm gone, he'd said during our last visit, his weathered hands trembling as he sipped his whiskey. Ain't nobody gonna believe it coming from a 100-year-old man anyway. I'm not sure I believed it myself until he showed me the journal entries. Dates stretching back to 1958. Meticulous notes, drawings that couldn't have come from imagination alone. Henri Beaulieu was the first white settler in this remote part of the Pacific Northwest. He'd built his cabin on the shores of what folks now call Copper Lake back when there wasn't another human structure for 50 miles in any direction. I'm going to share what he told me, as best as I can remember it. It was early spring of 1958 when I first noticed something wasn't right about my surroundings. I'd been at the cabin almost 8 months by then, living off whatever I could hunt, fish, or grow in my small garden patch. The isolation didn't bother me. After 2 tours in Korea, I craved the silence. That morning, I'd gone to check my traps about a 1/4 mile northwest of the cabin. All 6 were sprung, but empty. Not one animal, just depressions in the soil like something big had knelt down and carefully removed what I'd caught. At first, I figured it might be another trapper messing with me, but I hadn't seen another soul since the supply plane dropped me off the previous summer. I remember standing there, staring at those empty traps when I felt it. That sensation of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood straight up. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no squirrels chittering, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I gripped my rifle tighter and slowly turned in a complete circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. Something was there, watching. I called out, said I meant no harm, that whoever was there should show themselves. Silence. I hurried back to the cabin that day, constantly checking behind me. The feeling of being observed never left. The next morning I woke at dawn, like always, and stepped outside to find a young deer lying on the grass in front of my cabin. Its neck had been broken cleanly, not shot, not knifed, just snapped, no blood even. And there, pressed into the soft earth around it, were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were human-shaped, but massive, at least 18 inches long and proportionally wide. The stride length between them was nearly twice what mine would be. Whatever left them had to stand over 7 feet tall, maybe 8 or more. I stood frozen, coffee mug in hand, trying to make sense of it. Was this a peace offering? A threat? I'd heard stories from loggers about wild men in the mountains, but I dismissed them as campfire tales, meant to spook the greenhorns. I took the deer, waste not, want not, and dressed it properly. The meat would last me weeks. As I worked, that same feeling of being observed returned. This time I didn't call out or react. I just continued my work, pretending not to notice. 3 days later, it happened again. Another deer placed in exactly the same spot. This time, I was prepared. I'd set up a simple system, string tied to cans along the perimeter of my clearing. Nothing had disturbed them in the night, which meant whatever delivered the deer had known they were there and stepped over them. That took intelligence. After the 4th deer in 2 weeks, I decided to reciprocate. I left a small burlap sack of salt, a precious commodity out here, on the stump where I chopped wood. By morning, it was gone. No tracks this time. The ground had been too dry. That was the beginning of our arrangement. It was nearly a month later when I finally saw him. I'd taken to sitting on my porch in the evenings, smoking my pipe and watching the tree line. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, when a figure emerged from the forest. My breath caught in my throat. He, and I say he, because despite the strangeness of the sight, there was no mistaking the masculine build, stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark, reddish-brown hair from head to toe, except for his face, which had less hair and showed leathery, dark skin beneath. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his arms longer than should be possible for his height. He wore no clothing, except what looked like a simple leather pouch strung across his chest. And over one shoulder he carried a freshly killed deer. I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as he walked, almost glided across the clearing to deposit the deer in the usual spot. Then he straightened up and looked directly at me. His eyes were dark and intelligent, set deep under a prominent brow ridge. His nose was wide and flat, his mouth surprisingly human-looking despite being larger than normal. He made no threatening moves, just stood there, regarding me with what I can only describe as patient expectation. Slowly, making no sudden movements, I stood and went inside. I retrieved a larger sack of salt than usual and returned to the porch. I held it up so he could see it. He nodded, actually nodded, like he understood completely. I walked halfway across the clearing and set the salt down, then backed away to the porch. He waited until I was seated again before approaching the salt. He picked it up, made a sound in his throat that might have been satisfaction, and turned to leave. At the edge of the trees, he paused and looked back at me. He thumped his chest once with his free hand and disappeared into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to categorize it, to make it fit into my understanding of the world. He wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, wasn't any known animal. He moved with purpose and intelligence. I started calling him the trader in my mind. Over the next month, the trader came regularly, always with a deer or sometimes an elk. I always left salt for him. Once, curious about his preferences, I left smoked salmon and trout instead, the finest I had. He approached, examined my offering, then shook his head. Actually shook it from side to side like a man would. He made a grunting sound and slapped his belly with his open palm, then gestured toward the lake. The message was clear as day. He had plenty of fish already. I nodded and went to get the salt. When I returned, he seemed pleased. He took it and was gone again into the trees. After a while, a pattern developed. He would come every 10 days or so, always at dusk, always alone. Sometimes he would stay longer, watching me from the edge of the clearing as I went about my evening chores. I began to feel less like I was being observed and more like I was entertaining a visitor. Once, I tried approaching him with a jar of coffee beans to see if he'd like the smell. He backed away quickly, disappearing into the trees before I got within 20 feet. I didn't try that again. By midsummer, I'd confirmed there were others like him. Occasionally, I'd spot movement in the trees, smaller figures, observing from a distance. I never saw them clearly, but I caught glimpses of a female with what might have been a juvenile. They never approached the clearing. The trader, however, grew slightly more comfortable with each visit. He would watch me longer, sometimes make gestures that seemed to have meaning, though I could never quite decipher what he was trying to communicate. The incident with the cougar happened in late August. I'd been out on the lake in my canoe since dawn, fishing for trout. The day was hot, unusually so for that time of year, and I'd brought my 2 dogs with me, German shepherds named Rex and Scout. They were swimming near the shore, cooling off. I was about 50 yards from my small dock when I heard the dogs start barking frantically. I turned to see them racing up onto the dock, a mountain lion in pursuit. The big cat had them trapped at the end of the dock with nowhere to go but the water. Both dogs jumped in, swimming desperately toward my canoe. The cougar stopped at the edge of the dock, pacing back and forth, clearly frustrated at losing its prey. I started paddling toward shore, rifle ready, but I was still too far away to take a clear shot without risking hitting my dock. That's when it happened. From the tree line burst the trader, moving faster than I'd ever seen anything that size move. In his hands was what looked like a club, a broken tree limb about 4 feet long and thick as my thigh. He covered the distance to the dock in seconds, the ground literally shaking with each stride. The cougar turned, sensing the new threat, but it never had a chance. The trader swung that makeshift club with such force that when it connected with the big cat, the sound echoed across the lake like a gunshot. The cougar was dead instantly, its body thrown nearly 10 feet by the impact. But that wasn't what stunned me most. It was the fact that the force of the blow had splintered half the boards on my dock, shattered them. My dock was made of 2-inch thick cedar planks, and they broke like matchsticks. The trader stood there, breathing heavily, the broken club still in his hand. He looked out to where I sat frozen in my canoe, my dogs swimming toward me, whimpering. He nodded once, then bent down and picked up the dead cougar with one hand, slinging it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. As he turned to leave, he paused and bent down again. He picked up a fish I'd left cleaning on the dock, a 3-pound trout, and popped it into his mouth whole. Then he disappeared back into the forest. I sat in that canoe for a long time, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The raw power, the deliberate intervention. He'd saved my dogs. But why? It took me nearly an hour to work up the courage to paddle back to what remained of my dock. Our trading continued through the fall, though with decreasing frequency. By October, I began to notice logging operations starting up about 15 miles south of my cabin. Helicopters would occasionally fly overhead. Trucks could be heard in the distance. The trader's visits became less predictable. Sometimes he would come as usual with game to trade. Other times, I'd just find a deer left during the night. Twice, I found strange arrangements of broken branches left on the edge of my clearing, patterns that seemed deliberate, but whose meaning I couldn't decipher. The last time I saw him was in early November. He came at dawn rather than dusk, which was unusual. He carried no deer this time, just stood at the edge of the clearing watching my cabin. I came out onto the porch, bag of salt in hand, but he made no move to approach. He raised one massive arm and pointed north, then tapped his chest. He repeated the gesture 3 times, then he turned and walked away. I never saw him again. By spring, the logging operation had moved within 5 miles of my cabin. I found huge footprints occasionally, but they were always headed north, away from the encroaching machinery and men. That was the story old Henry told me, his eyes clear and lucid despite his advanced age. He lived another 60 years after those events, but never again encountered the Big Indians, as he sometimes called them. They were smart, he told me on his last visit. Smarter than most give 'em credit for. They knew what was coming with all them loggers, knew their way of life was ending. I asked him why he never reported what he'd seen, never told anyone until now. What would be the point, he'd said, shrugging those bony shoulders. Nobody would have believed me. And what good would it do them, huh? To be hunted, to be studied? They left me alone all them years, because I left them alone first. Old Henri died peacefully in his sleep 4 months ago. Among his possessions was a small leather pouch filled with weathered hair samples that I've quietly sent to a university lab for analysis. I've yet to hear back. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my own porch overlooking the valley, where Copper Lake sparkles in the distance, I think I catch movement in the tree line north of here, just shadows and impressions of something large moving with surprising grace through the underbrush. The logging stopped decades ago. The forest has reclaimed much of what was taken, and sometimes I wonder if they ever came back. Those big Indians that traded with a lonely settler for salt and saved his dogs from a cougar. I keep a bag of salt on my porch just in case. Story 9. I don't usually share personal experiences online, but what happened to me last spring on the Klamath has been eating at me for months now. I've always been a skeptic about the whole Bigfoot thing, but after what I experienced that day, I honestly don't know what to believe anymore. I've been fly fishing the Klamath River in southern Oregon for almost 15 years. It's my happy place, where I go to clear my head and just exist with nature for a while. I know those waters like the back of my hand, especially the stretch about 8 miles downstream from the Highway 66 bridge. There's this perfect spot where the river bends slightly, creating this calm pool where the steelhead like to rest. It's secluded enough that you rarely see other anglers, but still accessible from the Forest Service Road about 100 yards back through the trees. It was mid-April, right when the spring runoff starts to pick up. The water was running higher and faster than normal, but still clear enough for decent fishing. I remember being excited because the weather forecast was perfect. Overcast but not raining, around 52 degrees with minimal wind, prime fishing conditions. I arrived at my spot around 6:30 a.m. The morning mist was still hanging over the water, giving everything this ethereal, peaceful quality. I remember feeling particularly good that morning. My arthritis wasn't acting up for once, and I'd just tied some new royal wolf patterns I was eager to try out. I spent about an hour setting up my gear, wading out to my usual spot, and getting into the rhythm of casting. There's something almost meditative about the repetition. Cast, drift, retrieve, cast again. I was so focused on watching my line that I tuned out everything else around me. I'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours, caught and released 3 decent-sized rainbow trout when it happened. I was mid-cast when I heard this sound. It's hard to describe, kind of like a whoosh of air, but heavier, more substantial. Before I could even process what I was hearing, there was this massive splash about 8-10 feet in front of me in the river. The water exploded upward like someone had dropped a refrigerator into it. The splash was so violent, it actually pushed water up past my waders, soaking the front of my jacket. For a split second, I thought maybe a tree branch had fallen from somewhere, but that didn't make sense. There weren't any overhanging trees above that part of the river. My heart was racing. I remember standing there, frozen, my fly rod still extended in mid-cast position. The immediate thought was, did someone just throw something at me? I looked around, scanning the tree line on both sides of the river, but didn't see a soul. After I calmed down a bit, curiosity got the better of me. I reeled in my line and moved downstream to see what had caused such a massive splash. The water was still churning where whatever it was had hit, and as it settled I could make out what looked like a large rock sitting at the bottom of the river in about 2 feet of water. Using the end of my rod, I poked at it. It wasn't just a rock, it was a boulder. I'm talking about a seriously large stone, easily 60-70 pounds, something that would take significant effort for a grown man to lift, let alone throw. I set my rod down on the bank and, stupidly looking back on it now, decided to try to pull this thing out of the water to get a better look. I had to use both hands and all my strength to drag it to the shallower part of the shore. My back still aches thinking about it. Once I got it partially out of the water, I realized just how big this thing was, roughly the size of a microwave oven, with jagged edges that had been smoothed somewhat by the river over time. That's when it hit me. Someone had to have thrown this thing. There's no way it fell or rolled into the river naturally, not with the trajectory it came in with, and whoever threw it had to be incredibly strong. My first thought was teenagers. You know, bored local kids looking to scare the old man fishing. I scanned both banks again, looking for any sign of movement or laughter. Nothing, just the sound of the river and birds in the trees. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me suddenly, like walking into a wall. This putrid, rank odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet animal fur and something musky. It's hard to describe, but it was overwhelming. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, but this was different. It was fresh and alive. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I've spent enough time in these woods to know the normal smells: pine sap, damp earth, occasionally a skunk or bear musk. This wasn't any of those. This was something I'd never encountered before. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and pathetic against the vastness of the forest. No response, just the rushing water and that awful smell getting stronger. I decided to walk up toward the Forest Service road, thinking maybe I'd spot whoever had thrown the rock. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I was looking for footprints or any sign of someone having been there. What I found instead made my blood run cold. About 15 yards from the riverbank, where the trees start to thicken, I saw impressions in the mud. Not footprints exactly, at least not human ones. They were enormous, easily 16-18 inches long, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. They were deep too, like whatever made them was extremely heavy. I'm a rational person. I tried to tell myself they were bear tracks, maybe distorted by the rain, but I've seen bear tracks hundreds of times, and these weren't right. Bears don't have 5 distinct toes that spread out like that, and these were, well, they looked more like massive human feet than anything else. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, but something kept me rooted to that spot, staring at those impressions in the mud. That's when I heard it. A sound from deeper in the forest that I still can't explain properly. It was a low, guttural vocalization. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. It had this resonance to it, like it was coming from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound seemed to vibrate through the trees. Then came the wood knocking, 3 distinct knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, 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 deliberate, spaced out, almost like a signal. I've spent my entire adult life in these woods. I know every animal's sound, from elk bugling to mountain lions screaming. This wasn't anything I recognized. That's when I finally snapped out of whatever trance I was in and realized the danger I might be in. I left everything, my tackle box, my net, even my favorite hat, and just grabbed my rod and started backing away toward my truck, never taking my eyes off the tree line. As I was retreating, I noticed movement about 40 yards into the trees. It wasn't clear, just a dark shape shifting between the trunks. But whatever it was big. Much bigger than a human, and it was standing upright. I'd like to say I stood my ground or took a picture or did anything useful, but the truth is, I turned and ran. I splashed through the shallows, scrambled up the opposite bank, and sprinted the quarter-mile back to the Forest Service road where I'd parked my truck. I didn't stop running until my hand was on the door handle. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard that wood knocking again. 3 knocks coming from across the river. It was following me. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine in one frantic motion. As I was backing out to turn around, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, partially obscured by branches, was a tall, dark figure. I couldn't make out details, just an impression of massive height and bulk. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. I slammed the truck into drive and got out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheels straight. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement on the main highway. It's been 4 months, and I haven't been back to that spot since. I called a buddy who works for the Forest Service a few days later and asked him if there had been any unusual reports in that area. He laughed and asked if I'd seen Bigfoot. I didn't tell him what happened. I just said I thought I'd seen some illegal campers. Here's what I know. Something threw a boulder that weighed as much as my 9-year-old grandson into that river. Something with enough strength to hurl it from the shore with force. Something that made tracks no animal I know could make. Something that smelled like nothing I've ever encountered. Something that could make sounds that didn't belong in those woods. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. I'm still trying to come up with a rational explanation, but I'm running out of options. All I know is that after 40+ years of being outdoors, I experienced something that day that I can't explain. And whatever it was sending me a very clear message. This is my territory, not yours. I've gone back to fishing other spots on the Klamath, but I always find myself looking over my shoulder now, scanning the tree line. And whenever the wind shifts and brings a strange smell, I pack up and leave, no matter how good the fishing is. Sometimes at night, I still hear those 3 knocks in my dreams. Story 10. I've been debating whether to share this for over 20 years now. My hand is literally shaking as I type this. The few people I've told either think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw that night in Idaho, and I need to get this off my chest. It was August 2001. I'm Bill Miseros, and I was 27 at the time. Me and 3 buddies, Jake, Trent, and Dave, had planned this canoe trip down the Salmon River for months. We were all experienced outdoorsmen, had been on dozens of trips together since college. This was supposed to be just another adventure. We'd spent the first 2 days paddling and camping along the river, fishing and drinking beers around the campfire. Nothing unusual. The 3rd day we decided to cover more ground since we were falling behind schedule. By sunset we were all pretty exhausted, but we figured we'd paddle a few more hours under the moonlight to make up time. The moon was nearly full that night, and the sky was clear. You could see every star. The river was calm, just a gentle current carrying us along. We had 2 canoes, me and Jake in one, Trent and Dave in the other. Around midnight, we stopped briefly on a sandbar to stretch our legs and have a quick snack. That's when Jake suggested we continue through the night, since the conditions were so perfect. I remember checking my watch when we got back on the water. It was 12:45 a.m. The temperature had dropped, and I put on my fleece. The moonlight reflecting off the water created this silvery path ahead of us. It was actually peaceful, beautiful even. Until about 2 a.m. We were paddling through a section where the river narrowed slightly, with steep banks on both sides. The forest came right up to the edge of the water. I was in the back of our canoe, steering, while Jake was in front. Trent and Dave were about 20 yards behind us. The first splash came out of nowhere. It was loud, way louder than a fish jumping. At first, I thought maybe a beaver had jumped in, but then there was another splash, bigger this time, and much closer to our canoe. Water actually splashed onto my arm. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, turning around to look at me. Before I could answer, there was another massive splash to our left, maybe 15 feet away from the canoe. This time I saw it. A rock had to be at least the size of a basketball, hitting the water. Someone was throwing rocks at us. That was my first thought. Some local kids messing with tourists. I scanned the left shoreline, and that's when I saw it. In the moonlight, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was broad-shouldered and covered in what looked like dark fur. Not a bear, it was standing upright, completely vertical, like a person. "Jake," I whispered, "don't make any sudden movements. Look at the shore, left side." Jake turned slowly. I heard his breath catch. "Holy shit," he muttered. "Is that a person?" It wasn't a person, no way. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung way too low, almost to its knees, and the way it moved, it took a step forward out of the tree line, and the movement was fluid, but somehow not quite human. Another massive splash hit the water, closer to us this time. The thing was picking up rocks, boulders really, and hurling them into the river around our canoe, not hitting us directly, but close enough that water was splashing into the boat. I heard Trent call out from behind us, "Guys, what's going on up there?" I didn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off the shore. The creature was paralleling us now, moving along the bank as we drifted downstream. It was keeping pace with our canoe, even though we were paddling pretty quickly at this point. I could hear its footsteps, heavy thuds on the forest floor, branches snapping underneath its weight. Another rock hit the water, this time just a few feet in front of our canoe. The splash was so big it soaked Jake completely. "We need to paddle faster," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't look at it, just paddle." Jake nodded, and we dug our paddles in, picking up speed. I glanced back and saw Trent and Dave doing the same, though I don't think they had spotted what we were seeing yet. The creature kept pace with us. It was moving through the trees now, but I could still see glimpses of it, a massive dark shape sliding between the trunks. Every few seconds, another rock would hit the water. The splashes were getting closer. I've been hunting my whole life. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, all kinds of wildlife. Nothing has ever made me feel the way I felt in that moment. It wasn't just fear. It was this primal understanding that we were in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Something powerful and intelligent that didn't want us there. After about 5 minutes of this, though it felt like hours, Jake whispered, "It's herding us." And he was right. The rocks weren't hitting our canoe, but they were landing in a pattern that was forcing us to paddle toward the center of the river, away from both shores. I realized then that Trent and Dave's canoe had caught up to us. They were right alongside now. "Do you see that?" Dave hissed. His face was pale in the moonlight. "Yeah," I said. "Don't provoke it. Just keep paddling." "What the hell is it?" Trent asked. His voice was shaking. Before anyone could answer, the creature let out a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar like a bear or a scream like a mountain lion. It was deeper, more guttural, but also somehow human-like. The closest thing I can compare it to is if you took a man's shout and slowed it down, made it deeper and louder. It echoed across the water, bouncing off the canyon walls. All four of us froze. The canoes drifted with the current as we stared at the shoreline. The creature had stepped fully into the open now. In the moonlight, I could make out more details. It was covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were massive, hanging at its sides. Its head sat directly on its shoulders, no visible neck. Its face was in shadow, but I could see the outline of a pronounced brow ridge. It stood there for a moment, completely still, watching us. Then it bent down, picked up another rock, this one bigger than all the others, and hurled it into the water. The splash was enormous, sending a wave that rocked both canoes. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, and we all started paddling frantically. For the next 20 minutes, we paddled harder than I've ever paddled in my life. The creature followed us along the shore for at least a mile, continuing to throw rocks into the water around us. The sound of splashing and those heavy footsteps followed us downstream. Eventually, the river widened, and the shoreline on the left side changed from forest to a rocky cliff face. That's when the rock throwing stopped. The four of us kept paddling until we reached a wide bend in the river. Only then did we slow down, our arms burning with exhaustion. We pulled the canoes over to a gravel bar on the opposite shore and just sat there trying to catch our breath. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Dave said, "What the actual fuck was that?" "You know what it was," Trent replied quietly. "We all know what it was." None of us said the word out loud. It seemed ridiculous, even after what we'd just seen, but we all knew. We'd just had an encounter with a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. We debated what to do next. It was still the middle of the night, and none of us wanted to keep going in the dark. But the thought of setting up camp after what had just happened was equally terrifying. In the end, exhaustion won out. We pulled our canoes far up onto the gravel bar, as far from the water's edge as possible, and set up a makeshift camp. Nobody slept. We took turns keeping watch, though I don't think any of us closed our eyes even during our off shifts. We built the biggest fire we could manage and kept it blazing all night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf in the darkness around us sent our hearts racing. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we packed up and got back on the river. We paddled non-stop until we reached our planned takeout point, a full day earlier than scheduled. The drive back to Boise was mostly silent. We tried to talk about it a few times to make sense of what we'd seen, but the conversation always petered out. What could we say? We'd seen something impossible, something that wasn't supposed to exist. We made a pact in the car on the way home. We wouldn't tell anyone about this. Who would believe us anyway? But over the years, I've broken that promise a few times. Told my wife after we got married. Mentioned it to a buddy once when we were deep into a bottle of whiskey. Nobody ever believes me. I don't blame them. It's been over 20 years now, and I've never gone back to the Salmon River. Jake and Trent haven't either, as far as I know. Dave moved to California a year after it happened, and we lost touch. Sometimes I wonder if they think about that night as much as I do. I've read about other encounters since then. Learned that rock throwing is apparently a common behavior reported in Sasquatch sightings. Territorial displays, they call it. It wasn't trying to hurt us. It was warning us, telling us to get out of its territory. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Tell myself it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or some guy in a costume playing a prank. But I know what I saw, the way it moved, the intelligence in its actions, the sheer size and strength of it, hurling those massive rocks like they were pebbles. I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't been there. But I needed to finally get this story out. That night changed how I see the world. It made me realize there are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat scientific categories. Every time I go camping now, I lie awake in my tent, listening, waiting for that sound again, heavy footsteps, branches breaking under enormous weight. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that silhouette in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the forest, watching us drift down the river. Whatever it was, it let us go. It could have done much worse. I think about that a lot. Story 11. I've never told this to anyone outside my closest circle. I'm still not sure I should be sharing it now, but after 5 years of keeping this inside, I need to get it off my chest. What happened that night near Sun Lakes has haunted me ever since. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was late August 2018. My buddy Mark and I had spent Friday night in Seattle, hitting up a few bars and catching a show at the Showbox. We stayed longer than planned since Mark knew one of the bartenders who kept sliding us drinks after closing. By the time we left, it was already around 3:30 a.m. Mark had crashed at my place in Stratford the weekend before, so this time I was riding with him back to his place. Stratford is a tiny dot on the map about 100 miles east of Seattle, and to get there you need to drive through some pretty isolated stretches of Route 17. The drive usually takes about 2 hours, but at that time of night, with zero traffic, we were making good time. I was actually dozing off when Mark shook me awake. It was around 4:30 a.m., still pitch black outside. We were somewhere south of Sun Lake State Park, on Route 17, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. "Dude, I gotta take a leak," Mark said, pulling his Honda Civic onto the gravel shoulder. "Been holding it since North Bend." I needed to go too, so we both got out. The air was chilly for August, and dead silent except for the ticking of Mark's cooling engine. No other cars in sight. The headlights were the only light source for miles, cutting maybe 30 feet into the darkness before the forest swallowed everything up. We walked about 15 feet off the road towards some bushes. The ground was uneven, covered in dry pine needles that crunched under our feet. I remember shivering slightly, partly from the cold, partly from how isolated we were. I'm not usually spooked by nature, but something felt off, like that feeling when you think someone's watching you. I was just zipping up when I heard it, a cracking sound from deeper in the woods, like something heavy stepping on branches. At first, I thought maybe it was just a deer or something, but then came another crack, louder this time. Whatever was making that noise was big, and it was moving toward us. "Mark," I whispered, "you hear that?" He nodded, already moving back toward the car. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what I can only describe as heavy breathing. Not like a person jogging, deeper, more guttural. My heart started racing. We weren't alone out there. We didn't run. Something told me running would be a bad idea, but we moved quickly back to the car. The whole time I could hear whatever it was paralleling us through the trees, moving faster now, as if it knew we were leaving. We reached the car, and Mark fumbled with his keys. I kept glancing back toward the forest line. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift and move. "Hurry up!" I hissed, trying not to sound as panicked as I felt. We got in and locked the doors, just as something large moved at the edge of the tree line. I'm not exaggerating when I say my blood went cold. There was definitely something there, just at the edge of visibility. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. The car's interior light had gone off by then, leaving us sitting in darkness, staring out at more darkness, but our eyes had adjusted enough to see movement about 30 feet away. That's when it stepped fully out of the trees. Even in the dim moonlight, I could make out its massive silhouette. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and covered in what looked like shaggy hair. It walked on 2 legs, but with a strange, hunched posture, arms hanging longer than a human's should be. "Holy shit," I breathed. "Mark, are you seeing this?" He didn't answer, just sat there, frozen. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. It moved with purpose, deliberate steps, not like an animal wandering randomly, and it was coming straight toward our car. My mind was racing through possibilities. Bear? No, it was too tall and walking completely upright. Person in a costume? Out here at 4:30 in the morning, miles from anywhere? No way! Mark finally snapped out of it. "I'm turning on the headlights." Wait! But he'd already hit the switch. The high beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the creature in harsh white light. I'll never forget what I saw. It was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair from head to toe. Its face was not quite human, not quite ape. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a deer's would. Its nose was flat and wide, and its jaw jutted forward slightly. For a moment, we just stared at each other, us in shocked silence, it standing perfectly still in the headlights. Then it tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious about us. That's when Mark hit the horn. The loud blare shattered the silence, and the creature's reaction was immediate. It made this sound, I still get chills thinking about it. It wasn't a roar or a scream. The closest thing I can compare it to is those videos of African wild dogs making that weird, tortured howling sound, but deeper, more guttural, and so loud it seemed to vibrate the air around us. Then it did something that truly terrified me. It reared back, raised its massive arms, and brought them down hard on the hood of Mark's Civic. The entire car shook with the impact. I swear, I saw dents form where its fists hit. Mark turned the key and revved the engine. The creature stepped back, seeming startled by the noise. It made that haunting sound again, then turned and moved with shocking speed back toward the tree line. Its gait was odd, a kind of loping run that ate up ground faster than anything that size should be able to move. Within seconds, it had disappeared back into the forest. We sat there for maybe 3 seconds before Mark threw the car into drive and peeled out, spraying gravel everywhere. Neither of us spoke for the first 20 minutes as he floored it down Route 17. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Finally, when we were approaching Moses Lake, Mark broke the silence. Did we just... He couldn't even finish the sentence. Yeah, I said. I think we did. A fucking Bigfoot, he whispered. Eddie, we just saw a goddamn Bigfoot. I didn't want to say it out loud, but he was right. What else could it have been? The size, the way it moved, the reddish-brown hair, everything matched the descriptions I'd heard. I'd always thought Bigfoot stories were bullshit, just tall tales people made up for attention. But now, I didn't know what to believe anymore. We made it back to Mark's place as the sun was starting to come up. We sat in his kitchen drinking coffee, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had been a bear, or maybe just some weird shadows playing tricks on our tired minds. But the dents in Mark's hood told a different story. 2 distinct impressions where the creature had struck the car. We need to go back, Mark said suddenly. Are you insane? I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Not right now, he clarified, but soon. We need proof, man. No one's going to believe us otherwise. He was right about that last part. Who would believe 2 guys claiming they saw Bigfoot while driving home drunk at 4:30 in the morning? We'd sound like complete idiots. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go back with him. Not that night. We were too shaken up. But the following evening. Mark brought his digital camera with the good zoom lens. We arrived at what we thought was the same spot around midnight and waited in the car for hours. Nothing showed up. Just the normal forest sounds, wind in the trees, the occasional distant owl. We tried again the next night, and then once more the night after that. Same result each time. Nothing. All we found was an area of flattened grass and broken underbrush, where the creature had emerged from the trees, but that could have been caused by anything. On our 3rd and final attempt, we walked a little ways into the forest with flashlights, calling out like idiots. Part of me was relieved nothing answered back. After about an hour of finding nothing, we gave up. Mark wanted to report it to one of those Bigfoot research groups, but I convinced him not to. I've lived in small towns my whole life. I know how fast word travels and how long labels stick. The last thing I needed was to be known as that crazy Bigfoot guy for the rest of my life. So, we kept it to ourselves. Mark's hood still had those dents, though he later claimed they happened when someone threw a rock at his car in a parking lot. I knew better, but I didn't argue. In the years since, I've gone down some research rabbit holes, reading accounts from others who claim to have seen similar creatures. Some details match up eerily well with what we saw. The height, the reddish hair, the curious behavior followed by aggression when startled. I found myself paying more attention to those stories now, wondering how many other people are keeping quiet about their own encounters. The thing that sticks with me most isn't just what I saw, but how it made me feel. There was intelligence in those eyes. It wasn't just some animal operating on instinct. The way it studied us, circled the car, reacted to the horn. It was processing information, making decisions. That's what truly scares me. Not that these things might exist, but that they might be smart enough to stay hidden so effectively. I still drive that stretch of Route 17 sometimes, usually in daylight now. I always slow down near where it happened, scanning the tree line. The forest looks completely ordinary in the daylight, just pines and underbrush stretching for miles. But I know better now. I know what's out there, watching from the shadows. Sometimes at night, when I'm home alone and the wind is making the trees creak outside my window, I remember that sound it made, that horrible, tortured howl that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and primal. And I wonder if somewhere out in those woods, it remembers us too. I still haven't told anyone else about this. My parents would think I'd lost my mind. My girlfriend would probably laugh it off. And my co-workers? Forget it. In a small community like ours, being the Bigfoot guy isn't exactly great for your reputation. So why am I sharing this now? I guess because sometimes I need reassurance that I'm not crazy. That what Mark and I saw that night was real. And maybe, just maybe, someone reading this has seen it too. If you're ever driving through central Washington late at night, stick to the main roads. Don't stop in the woods. And if you hear something moving through the trees toward you, something big enough to snap branches underfoot, get back to your car as fast as you can. Because trust me, you don't want to meet what's out there. Story 12. I've never told anyone outside my family about what happened that night in August 1987. I was just 11 years old, living in Terrace Bay, a tiny speck of a town in northwestern Ontario that most people couldn't find on a map if you paid them. Our house sat about half a mile from Lake Superior, with dense pine forest stretching behind us all the way to the water. Growing up there, we had this strict rule that none of us kids could be outside after dark. Every parent in town enforced it religiously. Be home before the streetlights come on wasn't just a suggestion, it was law. Miss curfew, and you'd be grounded for a week minimum. When I was really little, maybe 5 or 6, I remember asking my mom why we couldn't play outside at night like we did at my cousin's place in Toronto when we visited. The boogeyman might get you, she said, not even looking up from the dishes she was washing. The way she said it was weird, like she wasn't just saying it to scare me into behaving. I figured it was just some small-town paranoia until I was 8 and saw a black bear wandering near our compost pile early one morning. After that, I was convinced the boogeyman was just parent code for bears. Made perfect sense. We lived in bear country after all. That explanation worked fine for me until that night in early August. It was unusually hot, and our house didn't have air conditioning, just box fans in the windows that mostly pushed the hot air around. I was sharing a room with my younger brother Tommy that summer because my aunt was staying in my room for a few weeks. Tommy had fallen asleep reading one of his Goosebumps books, the bedside lamp still on. I remember being annoyed because the light was keeping me awake, and I was already sweating through my sheets from the heat. His bed was right under the window that faced our backyard. It must have been around 11:30 when I finally got up to turn off his lamp. I had to lean across his bed to reach it, and that's when I noticed the curtain was partially open. I was about to close it when something caught my eye outside. At first, it was just a dark shape moving along the tree line where our yard met the beginning of the forest. The moonlight wasn't great, but it was full enough that I could make out something big moving toward our back gate. I froze with my hand on the lamp switch. Whatever it wasn't walking like a person. It was tall, way taller than my dad, who was 6'2". But it was hunched over in a weird way, like its spine curved forward. I remember thinking its arms looked wrong. They hung too low, almost to the ground. The whole silhouette was just off. My first thought was bear, but I'd seen bears before. They don't stand like that. This thing was on 2 legs, moving deliberately toward our yard. I don't know why I did what I did next. Curiosity, maybe. Or that thing where you're so scared you do something stupid. I leaned closer to the window and moved the curtain just a little bit more so I could see better. The thing stopped, just completely froze mid-step. Then slowly it turned its head toward our window. I couldn't see its face clearly, just the outline of what looked like a long snout or muzzle. But I knew somehow that it was looking right at me, like it sensed me watching. I've never felt terror like that before or since. It was like ice water replacing all the blood in my body. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just stood there, locked in place, staring at this thing that was staring back at me from about 40 feet away. Then it shifted its weight, just slightly, like it was deciding something. That tiny movement broke my paralysis. I slapped the light switch off and dove under Tommy's covers, practically landing on top of him. He mumbled something and rolled over, completely oblivious. I laid there, heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake Tommy up. I was sweating even worse now, partly from fear and partly because it was at least 85 degrees under those blankets. But wild horses couldn't have dragged me out. I kept waiting to hear something, scratching at the window, footsteps on the porch, anything, but there was nothing except the sound of the box fan and Tommy's breathing. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up still in Tommy's bed. For a second, I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. Kids have nightmares, right? But then I heard my mom's voice from outside. "John, John, come look at this." The panic in her voice had me running downstairs and out the back door before I even put on shoes. My mum was standing in the middle of her vegetable garden, or what was left of it. The whole thing was completely destroyed, not eaten like animals sometimes do, but trampled, flattened, like someone had taken a steamroller to it. My dad came rushing out of the shed, and together we all just stared at the destruction. The tomato plants she'd been babying all summer were crushed into the dirt. The green beans, the zucchini, the pepper plants, all ruined. But that wasn't even the worst part. Our back fence, this sturdy thing my dad and uncle had built with pressure-treated lumber and metal posts sunk 3 feet into the ground, was just gone. Not broken in one spot like if a deer had jumped it. The whole 20-foot section facing the forest was flattened, splintered posts and all, like something had just walked straight through it without even slowing down. "What the hell could have done this?" my dad whispered, more to himself than to us. He walked over to examine the fence, and I followed behind him, my bare feet getting muddy from the morning dew. That's when he pointed to the ground. "Bear," he said, pointing to some impressions in the soft dirt. "Big one, too." I looked where he was pointing. There were tracks, definitely, but they didn't look like the bear prints I'd seen before. They were bigger, for one thing, and the shape was wrong somehow. I couldn't put my finger on why, but they just didn't look right. The tracks led from our yard straight down the slope toward Lake Superior. My dad followed them to the edge of our property, then came back, shaking his head. "I'm calling Gary," he said, referring to the local conservation officer. "That thing must weigh 500 pounds, probably got into someone's trash and then decided to cut through our yard." I wanted to tell him what I'd seen, that it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright and walk on 2 legs for that long. They don't have arms that hang down like that, and they don't stop and turn when they realize they're being watched. At least no bear I'd ever heard of. but I was scared to say anything, scared they'd think I was making it up or had just had a nightmare. So I kept quiet until after breakfast, when my dad left to meet Gary at the edge of the property. My mom was cleaning up the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors harder than necessary. She was upset about her garden, and I didn't blame her. "Mom," I finally said, sitting at the table pushing my cereal around, "I saw something last night." She turned from the sink, hands still soapy. "What do you mean?" "I saw what did that to the garden." I swallowed hard. I got up to turn off Tommy's light, and I looked out the window. There was this thing by the trees. The look that came over my mom's face then is something I'll never forget. It wasn't disbelief, it was recognition and fear. She dried her hands quickly and sat down across from me. "Tell me exactly what you saw." So I did. The tall figure, the hunched posture, the long arms, how it seemed to sense me watching and turned to look right at our window. With each detail, my mum's face got paler. When I finished, she just sat there for a long moment, staring at the table. "Edward," she finally said, using my full name, which she only did when things were serious, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not to tell anyone else what you just told me. Not your father, not Tommy, not your friends. No one. Do you understand?" I nodded, confused and a little scared by her intensity. "And you are never, ever to be outside after dark. The curfew isn't just some rule we made up to spoil your fun. It's to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. Was that the boogeyman you told me about?" She pressed her lips together into a thin line. "There are things in this world that we don't understand, Eddie, things that are better left alone." "You've seen it too, haven't you?" I whispered. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she stood up and went back to the sink. "Your dad and Gary are going to say it was a bear, and that's what we're going to tell everyone. That's what we're going to believe. Because the alternative—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "But what if it comes back?" My voice cracked a little. "It won't," she said firmly. "Not if we don't acknowledge it. These things, they feed on attention, on fear. The more you think about them, talk about them, the more power you give them." I wanted to ask more questions, but my dad came back in then with Gary. They were talking about bear repellents and whether we should report it to the rest of the community. Life went on. We repaired the fence, stronger than before. My mum replanted what she could of her garden. My dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property. But things changed for me after that night. I started noticing how the adults in town would sometimes stop talking when kids came around, how certain areas of the forest were just understood to be off limits, though no one ever explained why, how parents would exchange these knowing looks when the topic of the curfew came up. I never saw the thing again, not directly, but sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of our property, and occasionally we'd find strange tracks down by the lake that Gary would quickly dismiss as just a moose or probably teenagers messing around. I'm 47 now, with kids of my own. We don't live in Terrace Bay anymore. I left for college and never moved back, but I still won't let my children play outside after dark, no matter how much they beg. I can't explain to them why, just like my mother couldn't fully explain it to me. All I know is what I saw that August night wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. And whatever it was, it looked right at me, saw me seeing it. And that connection, that moment of mutual recognition, still haunts me all these years later. Some nights, I still wake up sweating, the memory of that silhouette turning toward the window as fresh as if it happened yesterday. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night past thick woods, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those unnaturally long arms and that hunched silhouette moving between the trees. The most terrifying part, I'm almost certain that if I ever did see it again, it would recognize me too. Story 13. It was April 2012, and I'd traveled up from Dallas to meet my brother for our annual turkey hunting trip. We'd been doing this for years, getting away from work, wives, kids, everything. Just us guys out in the woods for a week, hunting turkeys and drinking beer around the campfire at night. My brother lives in Seattle, so we'd meet up near Spokane every spring. This particular year, we had two other buddies with us, Mike and Dave, guys we'd known since college. The first couple days were normal. We set up camp, scouted some areas, and planned our hunts. The weather was good, cool in the mornings but warming up nicely during the day. We were in a pretty remote area in the mountains. You had to take Forest Service roads to get there, and there wasn't much traffic except for the occasional hunter or logger. On our third day, we split up to scout different areas. My brother and I decided to check out this ridgeline that looked promising. We hiked for maybe 2 hours before we came across this hunting blind someone had set up. It wasn't anything fancy, just some camo netting strung between trees with a small folding stool inside. What was weird was all the stuff left behind. There was a nice day pack, one of those expensive ones that serious hunters use. Inside was a really good skinning knife, a buck knife that probably cost at least $80, a pair of designer sunglasses with the case, a half-empty water bottle, and some granola bars. All stuff you wouldn't just leave behind. My brother picked up the sunglasses. "Who leaves Oakleys in the woods?" he asked. I remember feeling uneasy, like we were looking at someone's personal stuff they'd be coming back for. But the strange part was that there was a thin layer of dust on everything, like it had been there for at least a few days, maybe weeks. "Maybe they got a deer and were in a hurry to track it," I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. You don't leave your pack and knife behind when tracking an animal. In April, "Deer season's been over for months," my brother said, putting the sunglasses back. We marked the location on our GPS and decided to report it to the local ranger station when we got a chance. It just seemed odd that someone would leave all their expensive gear behind like that. 2 days later is when it happened. The day started normal enough. We'd had decent luck hunting. My brother had bagged a turkey the day before, and Mike had gotten one that morning. I hadn't had any luck yet, so I decided to go off on my own for an afternoon hunt while the others hung around camp. I took my quad up this Forest Service road I'd spotted on our map. It wasn't marked as closed, but it clearly hadn't been maintained in years. It was overgrown in spots and washed out in others, but my quad could handle it. The road switchbacked up the mountain, and I figured there might be a good vantage point at the top where I could glass for turkeys in the valleys below. It took about 45 minutes to reach the top. The road just kind of ended in a small clearing. I parked my quad, left my helmet on the handlebars, and grabbed my shotgun and binoculars. It was around 2 p.m., and I had several hours of daylight left. I'd been glassing the area for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it. A clear, distinct knocking sound, like someone taking a baseball bat and hitting a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, maybe 5 seconds apart. At first, I thought it was another hunter, maybe signaling to his buddy. But then it happened again, from a slightly different direction. Knock, knock, knock. "Hello," I called out. No response. I stood there for maybe another minute before it happened again. This time it sounded closer. The knocks were loud, like really loud. Even with the wind and the natural forest sounds, they cut through everything. Now, I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what it sounds like when a woodpecker is going at a tree or when a branch falls. This wasn't that. These were deliberate, powerful strikes against wood. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line with my binoculars, but saw nothing unusual. The forest was thick, mostly pine and fir trees with dense underbrush. Something could easily hide in there and watch me without me seeing it. And that's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not just observed, but hunted, studied. like whatever was out there was sizing me up. I felt the eyes of animals on me before. When you're hunting, sometimes you get that feeling right before you spot a deer or an elk watching you from the brush. This was different. This felt intelligent, calculating. The knocking sounds came again, this time from two different directions within seconds of each other, like they were communicating. I'm not a guy who scares easily. I've been charged by a wounded wild boar, I've had close encounters with bears, I've been lost in the woods overnight. But standing there on that mountain, hearing those knocks and feeling those eyes on me, I've never been so terrified in my life. I didn't even think, I just reacted. I practically ran back to my quad, threw my shotgun in the scabbard, and started it up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the handlebars. I didn't even put my helmet back on, just left it hanging there and took off down the mountain. The whole way down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something emerge from the trees. The road switched back down the mountain, and at every turn, I'd slow down just enough to look up at the section I'd just come from. I didn't see anything, not directly. But a couple of times I swear I saw movement in the trees. Not an animal running, but like something big moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with me through the forest. At one point, about halfway down, I had to slow down for this washed-out section of road. As I carefully navigated over some rocks, I heard a branch snap loudly in the forest to my right, like something big had stepped on it. I gunned the engine after that, safety be damned. When I finally reached the main Forest Service road at the bottom, I stopped and looked back up the mountain. The trees were silent, no knocking, no movement, just the normal sounds of the forest. But that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I rode back to camp like my life depended on it. When I got there, my brother could immediately tell something was wrong. I was pale, sweating, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "What happened?" he asked, getting up from his camp chair. "Did you fall? Is the quad okay?" I told them what happened, the knocking sounds, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something had followed me down the mountain. Mike and Dave exchanged looks like they thought I was exaggerating or had gotten spooked by normal forest sounds. My brother, though, he just listened intently. "Knocking sounds?" he asked. "Like wood on wood?" I nodded. "Yeah, like someone hitting a tree with a bat or a stick, really loud, deliberate knocks." He didn't say anything for a moment, then asked, "Did you see anything?" "No," I admitted. "Just felt like something was watching me, following me." Dave laughed nervously. "Probably just a bear, man. They make all kinds of weird noises." But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't communicate with wood knocks. They don't stalk you down a mountain without showing themselves. They don't make you feel like prey in quite that way. My brother suggested we go back up there together the next day. I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to look like a coward. Plus, I'd left my helmet hanging on the quad in my panic to leave. So the next morning, the two of us headed back up that same Forest Service road. In the daylight, with my brother beside me, the forest didn't seem as threatening. We reached the clearing at the top without incident. My helmet was still there on the handlebars, untouched. We spent about an hour up there, listening and watching. Nothing, no knocking sounds, no feeling of being watched. It was just a beautiful day in the mountains. "Maybe it was just the wind," my brother suggested as we prepared to head back down. "Or trees rubbing together." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. That night around the campfire, Mike mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "I heard something weird last night," he said casually, poking at the fire with a stick. "After you all went to bed. It was around 2 a.m., and I got up to take a leak. When I was standing there at the edge of camp, I heard this, I don't know, this growling sound, and then like this huffing noise, like something breathing heavy." Dave rolled his eyes. "Bear," he said dismissively. Mike shook his head. "I don't think so, man. It sounded bigger. And it was close, just beyond where our light reached. I shone my flashlight out there but didn't see anything." My brother and I exchanged looks across the fire. Neither of us said what we were thinking. The next day was our last full day at camp. We were supposed to hunt in the morning and then pack up to leave early the following day. I stuck close to camp, not feeling the urge to venture out alone again. My brother went with Mike to a spot about a mile away where they'd seen turkey sign. That night, as we sat around the fire for the last time, my brother finally said what I think we'd both been thinking. "You know what some people say makes knocking sounds in the woods, right?" he asked, looking directly at me. I nodded slowly. "Bigfoot," I said, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. Dave laughed out loud. "Oh, come on! You guys can't be serious!" Mike didn't laugh. "My uncle swears he saw one near Mount St. Helens back in the 90s, said it was at least 8 feet tall." We stayed up late that night, talking about Bigfoot stories and other weird things people claim to have seen in the woods. Dave remained skeptical, making jokes about guys in gorilla suits. But the rest of us weren't so sure. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside our tent had me wide awake, listening. At one point, I swear I heard the knocking again, distant but distinct. 3 knocks in succession, but I didn't wake my brother. I didn't want to know if he heard it too. The next morning, as we packed up camp, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something watching us. We never found an explanation for the abandoned gear in that hunting blind. We never figured out what made those knocking sounds or what followed me down the mountain. I've been back to Washington several times since then for our annual hunting trip, but I've never returned to that specific area. My brothers suggested it a couple times, but I always find a reason to hunt somewhere else. I still don't know what was out there that day. I never saw anything directly, never had that movie moment where a Bigfoot stepped out onto the road in front of me. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And to this day, whenever I'm in the woods alone and hear an unexpected sound, I freeze, I listen, and part of me is always ready to run. Story 14. I still don't know what I saw that day, but it's been haunting me for years now. I'm not usually one to believe in this kind of stuff, but after what happened near Wawa, Ontario, back in September 2007, I can't explain it any other way. I was driving alone on Highway 17, heading west, about 20 miles south of Wawa. If you've never been there, it's incredibly remote. Dense forest on one side, Lake Superior stretching out on the other. Cell service is spotty at best, and you can drive for an hour without seeing another car. I was making a trip from Sault-Ste-Marie to Thunder Bay for work, and decided to take the scenic route along the lake. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, still plenty of daylight, clear skies. I had the windows cracked open a bit, catching that crisp September air. The trees were just starting to change color. Early fall in northern Ontario is beautiful, but there's something eerie about that much wilderness stretching out in all directions. I wasn't really thinking about much, just enjoying the drive and listening to the radio fade in and out as the signal weakened the further I got from any towns. I remember the song cut out completely, and for a few minutes there was just static, then silence when I finally turned it off. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards ahead, something stepped out onto the highway from the forest side. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe a hiker or a local. But immediately I knew something was off. The figure was walking upright on 2 legs, but there was something unusual about the way it moved. Purposeful, but somehow different from a normal human gait. The thing that really struck me was the color. It was completely, uniformly brown, not like someone wearing brown clothes. I mean a solid brown from head to toe. No variation where you'd expect to see skin or different colored clothing. No backpack, no hiking gear, just this solid brown figure. I instinctively eased off the gas. The figure crossed the road quickly, not running, but with long strides. It disappeared into the brush on the lakeside of the highway. The whole sighting lasted maybe 10 seconds, but I can still replay it in my mind, like a video clip. I remember thinking, what the hell was that? My heart was racing a bit, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over at the spot where the figure had crossed. The shoulder was narrow, but there was enough room to safely park. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, wondering if I should just keep driving, but I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what I'd seen. I shut off the engine, grabbed my phone, no service, of course, and got out. The air was dead quiet, no birds, no wind in the trees. Just the ticking of my cooling engine and the distant sound of small waves on the lake shore down the embankment. Where the figure had entered the brush, there was a small game trail leading down toward the lake. The brush wasn't as thick as I expected, mostly small birch and alder with some pine. I hesitated at the edge of the road, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. But whatever I'd seen was probably long gone, and I just wanted to confirm to myself it was a hiker or something normal. I followed the trail down about 30 feet. The path was narrow but clear, definitely used regularly by animals. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed some depressions that could have been footprints, but nothing clear or definitive. The trail curved toward the lake, and I followed it for another minute. That's when the feeling hit me. It's hard to describe, but anyone who's spent time in the wilderness knows the sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to look behind me, but I was also afraid to turn around. It felt like something was watching me from somewhere in the trees, not from the direction of the lake, but from deeper in the brush, as if whatever I'd followed had circled around. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, nothing, just that feeling of eyes on me. I stood completely still for maybe 30 seconds, straining to hear anything. Then, from somewhere off to my right, I heard a branch snap. Not loud, but distinct. That was enough for me. I turned and walked quickly back to my car, fighting the urge to run, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I got back to the highway, I stood by my car for a few minutes, staring into the brush. Nothing moved, no further sounds, but that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I got in my car and sat there trying to process what had happened. What had I seen? A hiker. But who hikes in such a remote area without gear, and why would they be uniformly brown? A hunter, maybe. But it wasn't hunting season, and again, the uniform color didn't make sense. No orange safety vest, no visible weapon. As I sat there, another car passed, the first I'd seen in at least an hour. I almost flagged them down, but couldn't imagine what I'd say. "Hey, did you see the brown figure that crossed the road?" They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I decided to continue to Wawa. It was the closest town, and I needed to talk to someone about what I'd seen. Maybe a local would have an explanation, a known eccentric who walks the highways, or some kind of local wildlife I wasn't familiar with. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town. The woman at the front desk was friendly, and after I got settled in my room, I went back to the office and casually asked if people ever reported seeing strange things on the highway south of town. She gave me a curious look and asked what I meant. I tried to sound casual, saying I thought I'd seen someone walking along the highway in a strange brown outfit. Her expression changed slightly, not alarmed, but definitely interested. "Where exactly was this?" she asked. I described the location as best I could, mentioning the curve in the road and the small game trail. She nodded slowly. "That area has some stories attached to it." When I asked what kind of stories, she hesitated, then said, "Some people think they've seen things in the woods around there. Not just people, something else." I pressed her for details, and she reluctantly mentioned that some locals and travelers had reported seeing what they described as a Sasquatch in that area over the years. She quickly added that she'd never seen anything herself, and that most people chalked it up to overactive imaginations or mistaken identities of bears standing on hind legs. I didn't tell her the details of what I'd seen, the uniform brown color, the way it moved, how it seemed to disappear so quickly, but her mention of Sasquatch sent a chill through me. I'd never given any credence to those stories before. I tried to laugh it off, thanked her, and went back to my room. I spent the evening researching on my laptop, looking up Sasquatch sightings in northern Ontario. There were more than I expected, including several along that stretch of Highway 17. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that brown figure crossing the road, and that feeling of being watched in the brush kept coming back to me. The next morning, I decided I had to go back. I needed to see the area in broad daylight, and I wanted to look for any evidence of what I'd seen, but I didn't want to go alone. At breakfast in the motel's small dining area, I struck up a conversation with two guys who were in town for fishing. After some general chat, I mentioned what I'd seen. To my surprise, they were interested rather than dismissive. One of them, Dave, said his uncle had a similar experience near Sault Ste. Marie years ago. They agreed to come with me to the spot. I think they were more intrigued by the adventure than actually believing my story, but I was grateful for the company. We drove back to where I'd pulled over the day before. In daylight with two other people, the place seemed less ominous. We followed the same game trail I'd taken. The ground was still damp, and about 50 feet down the trail, Dave called us over. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. Not just any footprint, this was huge. It measured about 12.5 inches long and 5.5 inches wide. We could clearly make out 5 toe impressions and a defined heel. It wasn't like any human footprint I'd ever seen. The proportions were off, wider and with toes that seemed more spread out. The other guy, Mike, was skeptical, suggesting it could be a bear print that had been distorted by rain. But it looked nothing like a bear print to me. There was only one clear print. We couldn't find a trackway or second-foot impression despite searching the area thoroughly. We continued down the path toward the lake, but found nothing else unusual. The feeling of being watched didn't return, and the woods seemed normal. Birds singing, squirrels scampering around. Whatever presence I'd felt the day before was gone. We took some photos of the footprint with our phones, though the images didn't capture the size or detail very well. On the way back to town, we discussed what it could have been. Dave was convinced it was a Sasquatch print. Mike remained skeptical, but admitted he couldn't explain it. As for what I saw crossing the road, the more I think about it, the less it matches the typical Sasquatch descriptions I've read. It wasn't the massive, bulky creature often reported. This figure was slimmer, more erect in its posture, not stooped or ape-like, and it wasn't particularly tall, probably less than 6 feet. I couldn't make out facial features or details because of the distance and how quickly it crossed the road. But it was definitely bipedal and moved with purpose, not like an animal that occasionally stands on 2 legs. It's been years now, and I still think about that day often. I've told the story to a few close friends, but mostly keep it to myself. I know how it sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were exaggerating or had seen a bear or moose and convinced themselves it was something more exotic. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt in those woods, and that footprint, I can still picture it perfectly. Too big for a human, wrong shape for a bear, in an area miles from the nearest house or campsite. I've driven that stretch of Highway 17 a few more times since then. I always slow down near that spot, always look into the trees. I've never seen anything unusual again, but every time I pass, that feeling returns briefly. That sense of being in the presence of something watching and waiting. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch. I don't know if Sasquatch even exist. But I saw something that day that I cannot explain, a uniform brown figure that appeared human but not quite, in one of the most remote areas of Ontario, that vanished without a trace in seconds. And whatever it was aware of me in a way that still makes me uneasy when I think about it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching travelers on that lonely stretch of highway, occasionally crossing the road when it thinks no one is looking. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the memory is particularly vivid, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 15. I can't believe I'm actually writing this down. I've been going back and forth about whether to share this experience for weeks now, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar? I don't know. I just know what I saw wasn't normal, and I can't stop thinking about it. This happened about a month ago. I'm an avid birder, have been for nearly 15 years, and spring migration is always my favorite time to be out. The weather was perfect that day, sunny but not too hot, maybe around 60 degrees with a light breeze. My son Jake and I had driven out near Canmore for the day. We do this trip a few times a year since the bird diversity along the Bow River is fantastic, especially during migration. We'd started early, around 6:30 a.m., and by mid-morning we'd already spotted 27 species, including a couple of yellow warblers that had just returned from their winter grounds. Jake was getting a bit restless. He's 19 and likes birding but doesn't have my patience. So he'd walk back to the car to grab some snacks while I stayed by the river's edge to scan the opposite bank. The Bow River was running pretty fast that day, swollen with spring melt. The constant rush of water over rocks was the dominant sound, but occasionally I'd hear the sweet trill of a warbler or the distant tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker. I was standing on a small gravel bar, maybe 30 feet from the water's edge, using my Swarovski EL Tenig 42 binoculars, the ones my wife got me for our anniversary 3 years ago. They're not cheap, but the clarity is unbeatable, especially in low light under the tree canopy. I was specifically looking for ruby-crowned kinglets. They're these tiny olive-green birds with a ruby patch on their heads that they only flash when excited or threatened. I'd seen a flash of movement in the underbrush across the river, so I raised my binoculars to scan the area more carefully. The opposite bank was about 80 yards away, not too far, but far enough that I needed my binos to make out details of smaller birds. The bank rose steeply from the water, with a mix of spruce, aspen and lodgepole pine creating a dense forest. There was some undergrowth too, mostly shrubs and deadfall. I was methodically scanning left to right when I noticed something dark standing between two larger trees about 15 yards up from the riverbank. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree trunk, or maybe even a bear standing on its hind legs. Bears aren't uncommon in the area, so I paused to look more carefully. What I saw next still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The dark figure seemed to turn, deliberately, and look directly at me. I could feel it staring, even though I couldn't make out any facial features. It was like suddenly realizing you're being watched when you thought you were alone. That uncomfortable sensation of violating someone's privacy hit me hard, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. I adjusted my focus slightly, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. They weren't. This thing was massive, completely black, not dark brown like a bear, but utterly black, like a silhouette cut out of the forest backdrop. It was unmistakably bipedal and man-shaped, but much taller than any person I'd ever seen. It had what appeared to be arms hanging at its sides, but I couldn't make out hands or fingers from that distance. No clothes that I could discern. Just this large, dark figure standing perfectly still among the trees, facing me directly. The most unsettling part was that it had no distinguishable features at all. No visible eyes, nose, or mouth that I could make out, just this black form. Yet somehow, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at me. I could feel it. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lowered my binoculars for a second, thinking maybe there was something wrong with them, or that my eyes needed a reset. With my naked eye, I could barely make out a dark spot where the figure was standing. But it was too far to see clearly without magnification. I raised the binoculars again. It was still there, completely motionless except for what looked like a slight turn of its head as it continued to watch me. I'm not easily spooked. I've encountered black bears, cougars, even a wolverine once while birding, but this was different. Every instinct in my body was screaming that whatever I was looking at wasn't normal. "Jake!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and strange even to my own ears. "Jake, come here!" No response. He must have been too far away to hear me over the river. "Jake!" I yelled louder, not wanting to take my eyes off whatever this was. I kept the binoculars trained on the figure, afraid it would disappear if I looked away. It remained perfectly still, just watching. I estimated it had to be at least 8 to 9 feet tall, maybe more, based on the surrounding trees. Its proportions weren't quite right for a human. The torso seemed too long, the arms a bit too lengthy. "Jake, get over here now!" I was practically screaming at this point. I heard Jake's footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. "What? What is it?" He sounded annoyed, probably thinking I was just calling him for another bird sighting. "Take the binoculars and look across the river between those 2 big spruce trees, about halfway up the bank," I said, lowering the binoculars, but keeping my eyes fixed on the general area. "Tell me what you see." "You saw a bear or something?" Jake asked, taking the binoculars from me. "Just look," I insisted, my heart still racing. Jake raised the binoculars and started scanning. "Where exactly am I supposed to be looking?" "Between the 2 tallest spruce trees, about 15 yards up from the water. There's a dead tree trunk to the right of it." Jake adjusted his view, searching. After what felt like an eternity, he said, "I don't see anything except trees and that dead trunk you mentioned." "Look harder," I urged. "It's right there, a tall black figure." Jake continued scanning for another minute. "Dad, there's nothing there, just the forest. Are you sure you weren't seeing shadows or something?" I grabbed the binoculars back from him and looked again. My stomach dropped. The figure was gone, completely vanished, with no sign it had ever been there. The spot between the trees was empty now, just forest understory and dappled sunlight. "It was there," I insisted, lowering the binoculars. "I swear it was right there." Jake looked at me skeptically. "Maybe it was a bear that walked away." "No," I said firmly, "it wasn't a bear. It was standing upright the whole time, completely still, and it was looking right at me." "Let's go check it out," Jake suggested, already heading toward a spot downstream where we could cross on some rocks. Part of me wanted to just pack up and leave, but I needed to know. We carefully made our way across the river, hopping from rock to rock, the cold spray occasionally hitting our legs. The whole time I kept looking up at the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again. Once on the other side, we hiked up the bank toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. It was steeper than it had looked from across the river, and we had to grab onto tree trunks and branches to pull ourselves up in some places. "Hello?" Jake called out as we approached the area. "Anyone there?" No response except for the distant call of a Stella's jay and the constant rush of the river below us. We reached the spot where I was certain the figure had been standing. There was nothing unusual there. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that indicated anyone or anything had been there recently. Jake walked around, examining the ground. "The soil's pretty dry here," he noted. "Not great for leaving tracks." I found the dead tree that had been visible in the same view as the figure and went over to examine it. It was a long, dead lodgepole pine, grey and weathered, with no bark left. Using my Field App's measuring tool, which I normally use to estimate the size of birds at a distance, I determined the dead tree was about 9 feet tall. "This tree is 9 feet tall," I told Jake, "and the figure I saw was taller than this tree from my vantage point." Jake gave me a strange look. "Dad, there's no way a person could be taller than this." He paused, then added more gently, "You sure you weren't just seeing things? We've been out since sunrise." "I know what I saw," I insisted. "It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one, and it definitely wasn't a bear." We searched the area for another 20 minutes, calling out occasionally and listening for any response. Nothing. No unusual smells either, which I've heard can sometimes accompany Sasquatch sightings. The forest smelled normal: pine needles, damp earth, and spring vegetation. "Let's head back," Jake finally suggested. It's getting late, and we still have that 2-hour drive home. I nodded reluctantly. As we made our way back down to the river, I kept looking back over my shoulder, that feeling of being watched still prickling at the back of my neck. The drive home was quiet. Jake tried to make conversation a few times, but I was too wrapped up in my thoughts. I've been birding in remote areas for years, spent countless hours in the wilderness, and I've never experienced anything like this. I'm a rational person. I work as an environmental engineer, for crying out loud. I deal in measurable facts. But what I saw that day doesn't fit into my understanding of the natural world. It's been a month now, and I still think about it every day. I've gone back twice by myself, spending hours watching the same spot from across the river, but I haven't seen anything unusual again. I've looked up local folklore, asked subtle questions to some of the old-timers in Canmore, even reached out to a couple of wildlife biologists I know. No one has given me any satisfactory explanations. I've considered every possibility. Could it have been a person playing a prank? No way. Too tall, and the location was too remote. A bear? Definitely not. The shape and the way it stood was all wrong. Some kind of optical illusion or shadow. The lighting was good, and my binoculars are top of the line. The only explanation that makes any sense to me, as crazy as it sounds, is that I saw something unknown. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I never thought I'd be the person saying this. I've always been skeptical of those stories. Jake thinks I just got dehydrated, or that my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe he's right, but I know what I saw. That figure was real. It was watching me, and it was not human. I haven't told anyone else about this until now. My wife would think I've lost it. My colleagues would never look at me the same way again. But I needed to tell someone who might understand, who might have seen something similar. I go back and forth between wanting to see it again, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, and hoping I never encounter whatever it was for the rest of my life. The feeling of being stared at by something that shouldn't exist is not something I want to experience again. So that's my story. I don't have any evidence, no photos. I was too shocked to even think about taking a picture. No footprints, nothing except what I saw with my own eyes. Take it for what it's worth. All I know is that the forests around Canmore hide something that most people will never see, and maybe that's for the best.